The courtroom was silent. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your chest, making it hard to breathe. The tension in the air was thick, as if something was about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. Clint Eastwood sat at the defendant's table, his weathered face a mask of stoic composure, yet anyone who looked closely could see the tension in his clenched jaw. For a man who had seen it all in Hollywood, from the highest highs to the lowest lows, this moment felt like something different, something raw. Something real. The judge, a woman with steel-gray eyes and a reputation for being unyielding, peered down at Clint through her glasses. Her gavel slammed once, and the room went even quieter. "Mr. Eastwood, you've had quite the career," she said, her voice icy but controlled. "But today, you find yourself here, accused of." Clint's mind was still trying to process the situation. He'd spent decades in the spotlight, built his career on tough roles, legendary lines, and timeless movies. Yet here he was, in a courtroom, being roasted by a judge who seemed as if she'd just stepped out of the coldest corner of the universe. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table, but he didn't speak. He wasn't sure what to say. "Your reputation as a director and actor precedes you, Mr. Eastwood," the judge continued, her eyes narrowing. "But that doesn't protect you from the accusations of negligence, false promises, and the sheer arrogance you've shown in this business deal. You promised results, and you failed to deliver. And now you're here, facing the consequences." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The cameras flashed. It was a moment the public had been waiting for, a moment where the legend, Clint Eastwood, was knocked down to reality. And they loved it. They wanted to see the great man falter, to see him fall from grace. Hollywood icons weren't supposed to be vulnerable, weren't supposed to face the consequences of their own missteps. But Clint wasn't going to let this moment destroy him. Not today. He sat there, his gaze fixed firmly on the judge, but inside, he was calculating. The words she spoke, the accusations, they cut deep. He wasn't used to being on the defensive, but this was different. This wasn't a film script where he could deliver the perfect line, slay the villain, and walk away victorious. This was real life. And it had just turned ugly. He glanced to his side, where his lawyer sat, scribbling notes feverishly. Clint didn't need to read his lawyer's mind to know that things weren't going well. They had hoped for a quick settlement, a quiet resolution. But this was public. It was raw. It was a circus. The judge slammed her gavel again, bringing Clint back to the present. "You've been given multiple opportunities, Mr. Eastwood. But this is the end of the road for you in this courtroom." That was it. The moment everything changed. Clint took a slow breath. The silence was deafening, but he wasn't going to sit there and take it. Not without a fight. He stood up, and the room seemed to hold its breath, every eye fixed on him. The world outside the courtroom seemed to disappear for a moment. He wasn't Clint Eastwood, the aging icon of westerns and war movies. He wasn't the man who had faced down impossible odds on screen. He wasn't even the grizzled veteran who had spent years fighting in the trenches of Hollywood. No, in that moment, Clint Eastwood was just a man who had been knocked down, and he was about to rise. With all the grace and authority that had defined his career, Clint leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice low but steady. "You're right about one thing. I've been given multiple opportunities. And I've messed up. But don't think for a second that this is the end of the road. Not by a long shot." The judge's eyes flickered with something like surprise, but she quickly masked it with a steely resolve. "Is that so?" Clint didn't hesitate. "I've been down before. Hell, I've been knocked down more times than I can count. But I always get back up. And I'm telling you right now, this trial, it's not over. It's just beginning." A murmur rippled through the courtroom again, this time with more curiosity than mockery. People shifted in their seats, and Clint could almost hear their collective thoughts. What was he going to do? Mr. Eastwood, the judge said, her voice now tinged with amusement, you think you can just turn this around with a few words? Clint's eyes narrowed, his gaze never leaving the judge. No, Your Honor. I don't think that. But I do think you've made a mistake. And I'm going to prove it. Starting now. The room was silent, the tension more palpable than ever. It wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a battle, a fight for redemption, for dignity, for Clint Eastwood to prove that even in his twilight years, he wasn't finished. And as Clint made his statement, a new fire lit within him. He wasn't just going to sit back and take this roasting. He was going to fight. And this time, it wasn't going to be in front of a camera. It was going to be in real life, where the stakes were higher than ever before. Clint's voice rang out clearly, carrying through the courtroom like the unmistakable sound of a movie hero ready for his next big scene. You're going to see who Clint Eastwood really is. And trust me, you won't be disappointed. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood's name is synonymous with strength, ruggedness, and a no-nonsense attitude. The kind of man who doesn't need to say much but commands respect with every move. Yet, as much as his career might have seemed bulletproof, the truth behind his rise to fame was far from flawless. Clint was born in San Francisco on May 31, 1930, in the midst of the Great Depression. His family wasn't rich by any means, and Clint's early years were marked by hardship. His father, a factory worker, struggled to make ends meet, while his mother, a housewife, did her best to hold the family together. Clint never grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth, but what he did have was a fierce work ethic and a love for storytelling. From a young age, he found comfort in the films of the day, often sneaking into theaters as a teenager to watch cowboy heroes on the big screen. His love for cinema was no accident, it was in his blood. His father was a fan of movies too, and even though they didn't have the luxury of regular outings, Clint and his father shared an unspoken bond over those shared moments in the dark. Yet, despite that connection, Clint always felt a distance from his father, who was tough but emotionally distant. In many ways, Clint's desire to escape into films was also a desire to escape the pressures of his own family life. His mother was loving, but life wasn't easy in those days, and the family was often living paycheck to paycheck. But Clint didn't allow his upbringing to define him. He was a natural athlete, playing football in high school, though it was his towering, stoic presence that eventually set him apart. By the time he graduated from high school, Clint knew he wasn't cut out for the conventional path. College? It never interested him. Instead, he joined the Army during the Korean War, serving as a lifeguard and playing in the Army's baseball league. While his time in the service wasn't glamorous, it taught him discipline and the value of working through adversity, lessons that would stay with him throughout his career. After his time in the Army, Clint was still uncertain about what he wanted to do. He tried everything from real estate to being a mechanic, but nothing ever stuck. It was only when he moved to Los Angeles that his life began to change. At first, he struggled to find acting gigs. He took whatever roles he could, from bit parts in TV shows to playing extras in Western films. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept him close to the industry he'd always dreamed of joining. By the early 1960s, Clint had built up enough of a resume that Hollywood started to take notice. But it wasn't until he landed the role of the Man with No Name in A Fistful of Dollars, 1964, directed by Sergio Leone, that his career truly took off. The film was a game-changer. It was raw, gritty, and unlike anything American audiences had seen before. Clint's character was the embodiment of the American hero, silent, dangerous, and full of mystery. The film's success turned Clint into a star almost overnight. But with fame came its own set of problems. Clint had always been a private man, not one to get caught up in the Hollywood scene, but the pressures of stardom were impossible to ignore. The tabloids, the fans, the constant demand for his attention, it all started to wear on him. Clint didn't let it show, of course. He was Clint Eastwood, the tough guy, the lone wolf. But beneath the surface, things were far from perfect. His personal life, like his career, had its share of ups and downs. His first marriage to Maggie Johnson in 1953 ended in divorce in 1984 after more than 30 years. They had 2 children together, Kyle and Allison, but Clint's heart was never fully in the marriage. He had a reputation for being a ladies' man, and his relationships with women were often turbulent. His marriage to actress Dina Ruiz in 1996 seemed promising at first, but it, too, ended in divorce in 2014. Clint's personal life was a reflection of his public persona, complicated, but always under control. Despite these challenges, Clint's career continued to flourish. He directed some of Hollywood's most iconic films, including Unforgiven, 1992, which won him Academy Awards for Best Director and Best Picture. He became known for his gritty, no-holds-barred approach to filmmaking. His films were raw and honest, often delving deep into the complexities of the human spirit. But even as Clint became one of the most respected directors in the world, he was still haunted by the ghosts of his past. The pressures of the industry, the failed relationships, the long hours on set, it all took its toll. It wasn't until the early 2000s, when Clint started to slow down, that he began to reassess his life. He wasn't the young cowboy anymore, the man who could always rely on his tough guy persona. His body was aging, his career was shifting, and the world around him was changing. He started to retreat more into his private life, away from the limelight. His passion for filmmaking was still there, but Clint had become more selective about the projects he took on. He started to see the world through a different lens, not just as a director or actor, but as a man who had lived through the highs and lows of Hollywood, who had been shaped by the battles of his past. Yet, in all these years of hard work, Clint had never anticipated something like this, being dragged into a courtroom over a business deal gone wrong. It was supposed to be a simple contract dispute, a misunderstanding with the producers of his latest project. But somewhere along the way, things had escalated, and Clint found himself facing serious legal charges. The allegations were wild, claims of dishonesty, breach of contract, and reckless behavior. To Clint, it felt like something out of one of his films, a script written by someone who didn't know the real Clint Eastwood. But here he was, sitting in a courtroom, a place he never thought he'd find himself. He had faced down criminals on screen, fought in wars on film, but this, the courtroom, was a battle of its own. And this time, it wasn't just his reputation on the line. His very legacy, everything he had built over the last 6 decades, was being questioned. As the judge's words echoed in his mind, Clint realized something: he wasn't going to let this be the end of his story. Not yet. Not when there was still a fight to be had. Clint Eastwood had been through worse, much worse, and had always found a way to come out on top. This courtroom was just another challenge in a long line of battles. And Clint had never backed down from a fight in his life. The days after Clint's fateful courtroom appearance seemed to drag on, like a storm on the horizon that refused to break. Every headline, every article, and every gossip column seemed to take turns attacking him. The accusations kept mounting, allegations of negligence, deceit, and even sabotage in his recent film dealings. It was clear, Clint Eastwood, once the epitome of cool, calm, and collected, was now a target. The public's perception of Clint was rapidly shifting from revered legend to troubled has-been. Yet, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister at play, something deeper than just a misstep in business. He couldn't help but wonder if this was more than just a courtroom drama. It felt like a well-orchestrated attack on everything he had built. Who was behind this? His lawyer, Jason Burke, a young and ambitious attorney who had recently joined Clint's legal team, was growing increasingly concerned. "Clint, we need to address this head-on," Jason said one evening in their office, his voice tinged with frustration. "These allegations aren't just going to disappear. You can't stay quiet forever. The longer we wait, the worse this gets. We need to fight back. Clint leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. His mind was racing, but his exterior remained composed. I've been through worse, Jason. These kinds of things, they blow over. People forget. They always do. But Jason wasn't convinced. This is different, Clint. This isn't just some tabloid smear. There's something bigger happening here. I've been digging into the case, and I'm telling you, someone is pulling strings. These accusations didn't come out of nowhere. Clint's sharp eyes narrowed. He had always trusted his instincts, and something told him Jason was right. Who? I don't know yet, Jason admitted, pacing around the room. But I'm going to find out. We need to dig deeper. I'll start with the people behind the film deal. Someone setting you up. Clint nodded slowly, his mind already working through the possibilities. Who would want to take him down? Who had a reason to see his empire crumble? He had made plenty of enemies over the years. Hollywood was a cutthroat industry, after all, but this felt different. This wasn't just about a failed deal. This felt personal. The next few days were a blur. Jason worked tirelessly, trying to uncover who was behind the smear campaign, while Clint focused on preparing for his next court appearance. His usual bravado seemed to be slipping, though. The quiet confidence that had always been a part of his persona now felt more like a facade. Clint couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut that something was amiss. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day in court, Clint found himself alone at his favorite bar, nursing a drink. He wasn't sure why he came here, it wasn't like him to dwell on his troubles. But tonight, he needed to clear his head. The hum of conversation and clinking glasses surrounded him, but Clint felt distant, as if he were an observer in his own life. He needed clarity. He needed to make sense of all of this. Suddenly, the door to the bar opened, and a familiar face stepped inside. It was Tom Hanks, an old friend and fellow actor. Tom was the type of guy who always seemed to know the right thing to say, and Clint had always admired his grounded nature. Tom caught sight of Clint and made his way over to the bar. "Hey, Clint," Tom said with a friendly smile, sliding onto the stool next to him. "Mind if I join you?" Clint looked up, offering a small, weary grin. "Not at all. Grab a drink." Tom ordered a whiskey and turned to Clint with a concerned look. "How you holding up, man? I've been reading the papers. This isn't looking good." Clint took a slow sip from his glass before replying. "Yeah, well, it's a mess. But I'll figure it out." Tom didn't seem convinced. "You know, I've been around long enough to know when something doesn't add up. This doesn't feel like a simple case of bad business. There's more to it, right?" Clint met Tom's gaze, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "I think you're right. But I don't know who'd want to destroy me over a business deal." Tom leaned in, his voice lower now. "Clint, sometimes it's not about the business. It's about power. The people you piss off when you get too big. I've seen it happen to other people, people you'd never expect. Hollywood can be a pretty dirty place when people feel threatened." Clint nodded, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. "I've pissed off a lot of people over the years. Hell, I probably made a few enemies along the way. But this feels different." Tom's expression softened. "Just be careful. I know you've been through a lot, but this might not be a fight you can win by just playing it your way. People are looking to bring you down." Clint sat back in his seat, the weight of Tom's words sinking in. For the first time in days, he felt the fog lifting. This wasn't just about clearing his name in court. It wasn't just about getting back to making movies. It was about surviving in a world that was out to get him. "I'm not going to let them take me down, Tom," Clint said, his voice firm. "I've fought worse fights, and I've won. I'll figure out who's behind this, and when I do, they're going to regret it." Tom gave him a sympathetic nod. I believe you, Clint. Just be careful. The higher they aim, the harder they fall. The next morning, Clint woke up with a renewed sense of determination. He knew now that this was no longer just a legal battle, it was a war. And Clint Eastwood was no stranger to wars. He had fought battles on screen, lived through the chaos of Hollywood, and survived decades of shifting public opinion. But this time, it wasn't just his career on the line. It was his very legacy. As he walked into the office to meet with Jason, Clint felt a fire in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. This fight was far from over. Clint's entire world seemed to be spiraling faster than he could control. Every step he took felt like it led to a deeper, darker corner of the mess he found himself in. It was no longer just about clearing his name in court, it was about uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. And Clint Eastwood wasn't one to back down from a challenge, even if it meant risking everything. After his conversation with Tom Hanks, Clint's determination only grew. He couldn't afford to let his enemies control the narrative. He had spent too many years building a career on hard work and integrity. No matter what it took, he was going to expose whoever was behind this smear campaign and take them down. Jason, his lawyer, had been working tirelessly to dig deeper into the case. But Clint knew that sometimes, you had to take matters into your own hands. As Clint left his office that morning, he knew he needed to act quickly. He couldn't just sit back and wait for the court process to play out. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Walking out into the bright Los Angeles sun, Clint was surprised by the calmness he felt. It was as though the city, the one that had once been the epicenter of his life, was just another backdrop now. The glitz, the glamour, and the fame had faded into the background, replaced by a singular focus, finding the people who were trying to tear him down. He didn't waste time. His first stop was the studio behind the project that had triggered the legal battle in the first place. The producers, directors, and everyone else involved had been oddly tight-lipped when Clint tried to get answers. Something about it all felt off, and Clint couldn't shake the feeling that there were forces at work that were beyond his control. He entered the studio's executive building and walked straight into the lobby. The receptionist, a young woman with bleached blonde hair and a bright smile, glanced up at him with recognition but quickly went back to typing on her computer. "Mr. Eastwood, what a pleasure," she said with a forced enthusiasm. "How can I help you today?" Clint wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge. Now." The receptionist hesitated, then reached for the phone. "I'll let them know you're here, Mr. Eastwood." He nodded curtly and waited. It didn't take long before a tall, sharply dressed man appeared. It was Dean Morgan, the head producer behind the film project that had gone south. Clint had known Dean for years, he wasn't a man to cross. "Clint, good to see you. I didn't expect you to drop by. What can I do for you?" Dean's voice was smooth, but Clint could hear the unease underneath. It wasn't a surprise. Dean was always good at hiding his true feelings, but Clint had known him long enough to read between the lines. Clint cut straight to the point. "I know something's going on. These accusations against me, they didn't just come out of nowhere. You need to tell me what's happening." Dean's expression faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Look, Clint, I don't know what you've heard, but this is just a misunderstanding. The legal team is handling everything. You don't need to worry about it." Clint didn't buy it. "Stop playing games with me, Dean. I know someone's pulling strings here. I'm not leaving until you tell me the truth." Dean's eyes flickered with something Clint couldn't quite place, fear, perhaps, or guilt. Whatever it was enough to make Clint push harder. He leaned in, his tone lowering but growing more intense. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's really going on." For a long moment, Dean remained silent. Then, finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "You really want to know the truth, Clint?" Clint's eyes narrowed. Yes. Dean glanced around nervously, as if making sure no one could overhear. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "It's not just about the business deal. There's someone above us, someone who's got a vested interest in seeing you fail. It's been happening for a while now. People in this industry don't like how much power you have. You've been a major figure for too long, Clint. You've made a lot of enemies." Clint's stomach twisted. He had always known that Hollywood was a competitive world, but he had never imagined his career would become the target of something this calculated. Dean continued, lowering his voice even further. "It's not just the producers. There's a bigger game at play here, Clint. This is about control. There are people who want to see you fall. They think you've outlasted your time, and they want to take the reins from you." Clint felt a cold chill wash over him. It wasn't just about a simple business deal gone wrong, it was an orchestrated attack on his legacy. "So, who's behind it?" Clint asked, his voice steady but sharp. "Who's pulling the strings?" Dean hesitated. "I don't have all the details, Clint. But I've heard whispers. It's people at the top, people who have been in the business longer than you and me. You've made a lot of powerful enemies. And now, they're coming for you." Clint stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the revelation settle in. He had spent years building his empire, not just in front of the camera but behind it as well. He had always known the business was full of sharks, but this was something else. "Do you know who they are?" Clint pressed. Dean shook his head. "I don't, Clint. But someone is pulling the strings. You're going to need more than just a good lawyer. This is bigger than you think." Clint didn't say another word. He turned and walked out of the building, his mind racing. He had just learned something crucial. He was up against an enemy he couldn't see, but one that had been lurking in the shadows for years. As Clint got into his car, he realized that this wasn't just a courtroom battle. It was a fight for survival. And for the first time in his life, Clint Eastwood wasn't just fighting for his career. He was fighting for everything he had ever believed in. Clint sat in his office, staring blankly at the stack of legal papers in front of him. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating him with their weight. The once familiar room now felt foreign, a stark reminder that everything was unraveling. He had spent decades building his reputation, his career, his legacy, but now it all felt fragile, like it could come crashing down in an instant. He could feel the pressure mounting, but the worst part wasn't the public scrutiny or the mounting legal bills, it was the doubt. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had done something wrong. He had always been so sure of himself, so confident in his decisions. But now, with every headline that vilified him, a small voice inside his head whispered that maybe he wasn't the man he thought he was. Maybe, after all these years, he had made some terrible mistakes. But Clint wasn't the kind of man to wallow in self-pity. He had lived through worse, and he had always found a way to claw his way back. This time would be no different. He couldn't let his legacy be tainted by a few bad decisions. He had to keep fighting. As he picked up the phone to call Jason, there was a knock at the door. Clint's head snapped up, his heart racing. He wasn't expecting anyone. His mind immediately went to the worst possible scenario, another leak to the press, another attack on his character. But when the door opened, it wasn't a reporter or another lawyer. It was his daughter, Allison. Clint's face softened at the sight of her. Allison was the one person who could always ground him, who could make him forget about the chaos swirling around him. She had inherited his sharp wit and his fierce determination, but she also had a softness that reminded Clint of the better parts of himself. His relationship with her was one of the few things in his life that had never been tainted by the ugliness of the industry. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and sat across from Clint. There was a quiet intensity in her gaze, one that told him she wasn't here to talk about the weather. "Dad, how are you holding up?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Clint let out a deep breath. I've been better. Allison studied him for a moment, her eyes flickering with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. You're not just fighting for your career anymore, are you? Clint's heart sank. What do you mean? You're fighting for your reputation. For everything you've built. But you're also fighting for your soul, she said, her voice low but unwavering. And I think you know that. I think you know that what's at stake here is bigger than the films, bigger than the headlines. It's about who you are. Clint's chest tightened. He had always known that his daughter could see right through him, but hearing her say it out loud struck a chord deep within him. He had always prided himself on being the stoic figure, the one who didn't let anything rattle him, who stood firm no matter the pressure. But now, as the weight of the situation pressed down on him, he couldn't help but feel vulnerable. I've made a lot of mistakes, Allison, he admitted, his voice cracking for the first time in what felt like forever. Maybe I've let my ego get the best of me. Maybe I've lost sight of what really matters. Allison's eyes softened, and she reached across the table, placing a hand on his. We all make mistakes, Dad. You've done a lot of good, too. You've been a role model to so many people. But you're not perfect. And neither am I. None of us are. Clint looked at his daughter, his mind a swirl of conflicting emotions. There was a deep ache in his chest, a fear of losing everything he had worked for. But more than that, there was a growing sense of guilt, a fear that his mistakes had hurt the people he loved the most. The weight of his past choices, the times he had been too focused on his career and not enough on the people around him, hit him like a wave. He had spent so many years in the pursuit of greatness, and now, as the walls closed in, he wondered if it had all been worth it. I've failed you, Clint whispered, his voice barely audible. Allison shook her head, squeezing his hand gently. No, you haven't. You've always done your best. And you've given me everything I could ever need. But Dad, don't let this take you down. You're stronger than this. And I believe in you. Clint felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. The emotions he had buried deep inside were finally surfacing. He had spent so much time protecting his public image, so much time pretending that nothing could shake him. But now, with his daughter sitting across from him, he realized that the fight wasn't just about his career, it was about the kind of man he wanted to be. The kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. You're right, Clint said, his voice steady now, the tears threatening to fall held back by sheer will. I can't let this destroy me. Not for them, and not for me. I've been through too much to let this be the thing that defines me. Allison smiled, a small but powerful gesture of love and understanding. That's my dad. Clint smiled back, his heart lighter than it had been in days. He wasn't alone in this. He had his family, he had the people who believed in him, even when he doubted himself. And that was enough to keep going. As Allison stood up to leave, Clint felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his career anymore, he was fighting for the chance to make things right, to reclaim his integrity. He wasn't going to let the shadows of his past haunt him. He was going to take control of his story and make sure that his legacy wasn't defined by this scandal. Clint Eastwood wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The weight of Clint's revelations hung heavy in the air. His renewed sense of purpose burned brighter than ever before. He couldn't afford to let the shadows of his past or the people trying to tear him down control his future. It was time for him to take action. No more hiding behind lawyers or waiting for the system to work in his favor. Clint knew he had to face this head-on, once and for all. He had spent the last few days in a frenzy of planning and organizing, reaching out to everyone who might hold the key to the truth. His lawyer, Jason, had dug up some vital information, but Clint needed more. He needed direct access to the people behind the campaign to destroy him, people with the power to manipulate the situation for their own gain. Clint was no longer the stoic, untouchable icon. He was a man driven by a burning desire for justice and the determination to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The plan was set. The night before the final hearing, Clint sat alone in his office, staring at the papers in front of him. The courtroom battle was tomorrow, and he knew it would be the make-or-break moment. But deep down, he realized that this wasn't just about proving his innocence. This was about dismantling an entire system that had been designed to exploit and corrupt. He had seen too much of it in his years in Hollywood: broken dreams, false narratives, and careers destroyed by those who played dirty behind the scenes. He wasn't going to let himself become one of those casualties. The clock ticked away, the silence in the room broken only by the sound of his breathing. Clint looked out the window, seeing the lights of the city below. He had once been part of that world, but now, it felt like a distant memory. A part of him longed for the days when everything was simple, when the only thing that mattered was the next big film project. But he had grown too much to be the man who only cared about fame and fortune. Now, he cared about something greater: his integrity, his legacy, and the people who believed in him. The next morning, Clint dressed sharply, donning his favorite suit, the one that had seen him through countless press conferences and film premieres. He wasn't about to face the courtroom in anything less than his best. Today wasn't just any hearing, it was the showdown that would define the rest of his life. As Clint walked into the courthouse, the weight of the moment settled in. The courtroom was packed: reporters, spectators, and even a few familiar faces from his past. Clint's eyes scanned the crowd, landing briefly on a familiar figure: Tom Hanks. Tom had been his confidant throughout this ordeal, always offering a word of encouragement or an insight when Clint needed it most. Today, Clint wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever supported him. His lawyer, Jason, was already at the front, sitting at the defense table. Clint took his seat, the sense of finality heavy in the air. This was it. The last chance for him to expose the truth and take back control of his life. The judge entered the room, and the proceedings began. It felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on Clint as the opposing counsel stood up to present their case. The accusations continued to fly, the legal team on the other side painting Clint as a man who had broken the law, betrayed the trust of those around him, and had no regard for the consequences of his actions. But Clint wasn't about to let that narrative take root. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never been one to back down from a fight, but today was different. This wasn't just a fight for his reputation, it was a fight for the truth, for justice. Clint's voice was calm but firm as he addressed the court. "I've spent my entire life building this career, not just for me, but for the people who believed in me. I've made mistakes, yes. But I have never intentionally hurt anyone. I have always worked hard, and I have always believed in doing what's right. This is a smear campaign. A coordinated effort to bring me down." The courtroom was silent, the tension palpable. Clint's words hung in the air, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the power of his own voice. This wasn't just a man defending himself against false accusations, this was Clint Eastwood, standing up for everything he had ever believed in. As Clint sat back down, he could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. He had just exposed the heart of the issue, but he knew the battle was far from over. The other side was going to push back hard, they weren't going to let him walk away so easily. But Clint was ready for whatever came next. And then, in a move that shocked everyone, Clint's lawyer, Jason, stood up and presented the final piece of evidence. The moment Clint had been waiting for. Jason had uncovered a crucial connection, one that linked the orchestrators of the campaign against Clint to several powerful figures in the entertainment industry. People who had the motive and the resources to manipulate the media, twist the truth, and create a false narrative. The evidence was damning, and it left the courtroom in stunned silence. Clint watched as the judge's expression changed from one of neutrality to one of clear realization. This wasn't just about a single case anymore. This was about a systemic issue that went far deeper than anyone had imagined. The other side was rattled. For the first time since the case had begun, Clint could see the doubt in their eyes. They had underestimated him, but Clint had been playing the long game. He wasn't just a movie star trying to save his reputation. He was a man who had spent his life learning how to fight, and now he was ready to win. As the judge called for a recess, Clint's heart raced. This was the moment. He had done what he needed to do. He had exposed the truth, and now, it was in the hands of the court. But Clint knew one thing for certain: no matter what happened next, this was the moment that would change everything. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the recess stretched longer than expected. Clint could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced through every detail of the case. He had come so far, had faced so many obstacles, and now it was all down to this final moment. The truth had been laid bare. The pieces of evidence were there for everyone to see. But would it be enough? Clint sat in silence, staring at the front of the courtroom where the judge had stepped out for a brief consultation. His lawyer, Jason, was discussing strategy with a few other legal experts in hushed tones, his brows furrowed in concentration. But Clint wasn't focused on them. His thoughts kept drifting to the people who had been by his side throughout this journey: his daughter, Allison, who had reminded him of what really mattered, and Tom Hanks, his longtime friend, who had been a steady source of support. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that his fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever believed in him, everyone who had stood by him even when the world turned its back. He looked across the room at the opposing counsel. They looked like they were trying to come up with something, some last-ditch effort to discredit him. But Clint had already proven his innocence. The truth was undeniable. It was just a matter of waiting for the judge to acknowledge that. A sharp cough broke Clint from his thoughts. The judge had returned to the bench. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence as everyone waited for the proceedings to resume. Clint's pulse quickened as he looked toward the judge, his gaze unwavering. The moment he had been dreading, and hoping for, was finally here. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge began, his voice stern but measured. "You have presented a compelling case. The evidence has been examined, and the allegations against you have been thoroughly reviewed." Clint's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him, waiting for the judge's next words. However, the judge continued, "It is clear to this court that a significant amount of corruption has taken place, and those responsible must be held accountable for their actions. Your lawyer, Mr. Jason, has provided irrefutable evidence linking several key individuals to this smear campaign. As such, the court has no choice but to dismiss the charges against you." Clint's heart soared as the words sank in. The charges had been dismissed. He was free. He had won. The courtroom erupted into whispers, some of disbelief, some of relief. Clint's shoulders slumped as the weight he had been carrying for months seemed to lift off him in an instant. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clint allowed himself to breathe. The victory wasn't just a win in the courtroom, it was a triumph of truth, of justice, and of everything he had fought for. But as Clint glanced at Jason, who was smiling and shaking hands with the team of lawyers, something in him didn't feel entirely satisfied. Yes, this battle had been won, but Clint knew that the war was far from over. The people responsible for orchestrating this campaign had to be held accountable, and Clint wasn't about to let them slip away unscathed. The judge continued with his remarks, but Clint's mind was already moving ahead, thinking about the next steps. There was still work to be done. The truth had been uncovered, but it was time to expose the full extent of the corruption. He wasn't going to stop until every last one of those who had tried to ruin him was brought to justice. Jason turned to Clint with a smile. "We did it, Clint. You're free." Clint nodded, but his eyes were already fixed on the bigger picture. "This is just the beginning. We've got more work to do." The courtroom cleared out, and Clint stepped out into the light of day, the weight of the world finally feeling a little bit lighter on his shoulders. But the victory didn't come without its cost. Clint had lost a lot in the process. His reputation had been dragged through the mud, his personal life had been turned upside down, and the people he had trusted the most had betrayed him. But now, standing on the other side of this fight, Clint realized that he had something even more valuable than his former fame and success. He had his integrity. He had his truth. And he had something else, something that had become the foundation of his newfound strength, his family. Allison, Tom, Jason, and even the few loyal friends who hadn't abandoned him had helped him realize that, at the end of the day, that was what truly mattered. Clint's thoughts were interrupted as he saw Allison walking toward him. Her face lit up with relief and pride as she approached, and without a word, she threw her arms around him. Clint held her tight, letting the moment sink in. "We did it, Dad," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Clint squeezed her tighter, a lump in his throat. "You were right, Allison. It wasn't about winning a case. It was about holding on to who we are. It's about the truth." Allison pulled back slightly, looking at him with admiration. "I never doubted you for a second." Clint smiled, a sense of peace finally settling over him. "I couldn't have done it without you." As the two of them stood together, Clint knew that the journey was far from over. There would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face, and more obstacles to overcome. But he was ready. Ready to continue the fight for justice, ready to rebuild his life, and ready to reclaim the legacy that had been almost taken from him. But now, Clint Eastwood wasn't just a man who had survived. He was a man who had triumphed. And that was a story that no one could take away from him. Clint stood at the threshold of his office, looking out over the city skyline. It was a beautiful day, and yet, the weight of the decision ahead of him pressed heavily on his chest. The legal battle was over, but Clint knew that what came next was just as crucial, exposing the corruption that had almost destroyed his life. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, half expecting another congratulatory message, but the name on the screen was one that immediately made him tense up: Tom Hanks. Clint answered quickly. "Tom." "Clint, you're not going to believe this," Tom said, his voice urgent. "You're not the only one they've targeted. I've been digging, and it looks like there are a lot more people involved in this whole mess than we first realized." Clint felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean? Who else?" Tom let out a sigh. "I've been speaking with a few people who have had their careers wrecked by the same group, people who've been smeared by false rumors, their reputations ruined. This isn't just about you anymore. It's bigger. These people have been playing dirty for years." Clint's mind raced. He had known that there were forces at play, but hearing Tom's confirmation sent a chill through him. This wasn't just a case of personal revenge or a random attack, it was part of something systemic, something deeply rooted in the industry. "Tom, what do we do?" Clint asked, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We take them down, Clint," Tom replied. "We start by gathering all the information we can, reaching out to those who've been wronged, and then we go public. It's time to expose them all. No more hiding in the shadows. We shine a light on everything they've done." Clint felt a surge of energy. He wasn't just fighting for his reputation anymore. He was fighting for justice, for the countless others whose lives had been destroyed by this web of lies and deceit. "All right," Clint said, his voice low and determined. "Let's do it. Let's bring them to light." The plan was set into motion quickly. Tom put Clint in touch with a network of whistleblowers, people who had first-hand experience with the powerful figures behind the smear campaign. They shared stories of manipulation, blackmail, and ruined careers. The more Clint learned, the angrier he became. This wasn't just an attack on him, this was the work of people who had no regard for anyone but themselves, willing to crush anyone in their way. As Clint began to compile the information, it became clear just how vast the operation was. These were not isolated incidents. The same group of people had been behind the public humiliation of actors, directors, and producers. They had used their power and influence to control the narrative, to destroy the lives of anyone who dared to stand in their way. Clint's resolve hardened. He wasn't going to let this go. He had been silent for too long. It was time for a reckoning. He spent the next few days in a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions. Jason, his lawyer, had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering evidence and compiling a case against the individuals involved. But Clint knew that this wouldn't be an easy fight. These were powerful people with deep connections, and they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. But Clint had something they didn't, the truth. And with the truth on his side, he wasn't afraid to take on the people who had tried to tear him apart. The day of the press conference arrived, and Clint stood backstage, his heart beating rapidly in his chest. This was it. The moment when he would take the first step in bringing down the empire of lies that had nearly ruined him. The room was filled with reporters, cameras, and the hum of anticipation. But Clint was calm. He had been in front of the press countless times before, but this was different. This wasn't just another interview or promotional event. This was a declaration. A statement that he wasn't going to be silenced. Jason stood next to him, giving him a reassuring nod. "You've got this, Clint. The truth is on your side." Clint nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had never been more certain about anything in his life. This wasn't just a fight for his own redemption. It was for everyone who had ever been wronged by the powerful few who believed they could control the narrative. Clint walked to the podium, the lights of the cameras blinding him for a moment. He took a deep breath and adjusted the microphone. The room fell into a hushed silence. "My name is Clint Eastwood," he began, his voice steady. "And today, I stand before you not just as an actor, but as a man who has been wronged. Not just by the system, but by people who have used their power to destroy the lives of those who dared to speak out, who dared to fight back." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. The reporters leaned forward, eager for more. "I am here today because I believe in justice. I believe in the power of truth. And I believe that no one, not me, not anyone, should ever have to go through what I've been through. I've been smeared, lied about, and attacked by those who think they can control the narrative. But I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever." Clint's gaze swept over the room, making eye contact with several reporters. "I've gathered evidence. I've spoken to those who have been harmed by these people. This isn't just about me, it's about all of us who've been hurt by the greed and corruption of a few powerful individuals. And I will not rest until those responsible are held accountable." The room was silent. The reporters were staring at him, their pens poised, ready to capture every word. "I'm calling for an investigation," Clint continued. "An investigation into the people who have abused their power for far too long. And I will do everything in my power to ensure that justice is served." As Clint finished speaking, the room erupted in a flurry of questions. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed, and the atmosphere was electric with the revelation of a story that would rock the industry to its core. Clint knew that this was just the beginning. The real work was yet to come. But in that moment, standing before the world, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense of rightness, that he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer just Clint Eastwood, the actor. He was Clint Eastwood, the man who was going to bring down the corrupt system that had tried to destroy him. And he wasn't going to stop until every last one of them was exposed. The fallout from Clint's press conference was immediate and intense. The media exploded with coverage, some supportive, some skeptical, and some downright hostile. Headlines ranged from, "Clint Eastwood claims to be target of Hollywood conspiracy," to "Eastwood takes aim at industry powers, but is his story true?" The industry was abuzz, divided between those who believed Clint's allegations and those who viewed him as a man who had gone off the deep end. In the days following the conference, Clint found himself at the center of a storm. The calls came in non-stop, interviews, offers, threats, and even people questioning his sanity. Some of his old friends from the industry reached out, expressing their concerns, while others distanced themselves from him. The most unexpected was a message from an old acquaintance, Morgan Freeman. "Clint, I know you've been through a lot, but be careful. You're making powerful enemies. Trust your instincts, but be wary of who you trust now. You've got people watching you, and you don't want to find yourself in a position where you're outnumbered. Stay sharp." Clint sat in his office, reading the message with a deep sense of foreboding. Morgan had always been a voice of reason, and his words weighed heavily on him. He knew that going up against powerful people wasn't something to take lightly. But it was too late to turn back now. He had committed to this fight, and he couldn't stop, not when he was so close to exposing the truth. Jason had been by Clint's side throughout the entire ordeal, and the two of them spent hours strategizing and preparing for what came next. The legal battle was only beginning. The people Clint had named in his press conference weren't going to go down without a fight. They would use every resource at their disposal to discredit him, to destroy his credibility. But Clint wasn't afraid. He had the truth on his side, and he would fight until the end. The first major attack came in the form of a lawsuit. The group of powerful industry figures Clint had named publicly filed a defamation suit against him, claiming that his accusations were baseless and harmful to their reputations. The media jumped on the news, with some outlets calling it Clint Eastwood's downfall, while others declared it a tactical move by the accused to silence him. But Clint didn't flinch. He had expected this. The lawsuits, the threats, the public backlash, it was all part of the game. He knew that in the end, it wasn't about who had the loudest voice or the most money, it was about who could prove the truth. Jason worked tirelessly to build a defense strategy. They gathered even more evidence, emails, documents, testimonies from whistleblowers who were willing to risk everything to expose the truth. But Clint knew that the battle ahead wouldn't be won in court alone. The public's perception of him would be just as important as the legal outcome. And the media was relentless. One evening, Clint sat in front of the television, watching the latest news segment. The talking heads were debating his case, dissecting every word from his press conference, questioning his motives, and speculating on his mental state. He could see the mounting pressure, the way the narrative was slowly starting to shift against him. It was clear, if he didn't act fast, the tide could turn in a direction he wouldn't be able to recover from. "Clint, we need to do something. We can't just sit here and let them control the narrative," Jason said, his voice tinged with frustration. "They're spinning this out of control." Clint nodded, his face a mask of determination. He had expected the media to turn on him, but he hadn't realized just how quickly they could rewrite the story. "What do you suggest?" Jason looked at Clint with a serious expression. "You have to take control of the narrative. If we let them continue to dictate the story, we'll lose. You need to tell your side, your real side, before they do." Clint stood up, pacing across the room. Jason was right. This wasn't just about fighting in court, it was about fighting for the truth in the public eye. He had to take back control of his own story, or it would be lost forever. "I'm going to do it," Clint said, his voice resolute. "I'll sit down with the media. But this time, it's on my terms." The next day, Clint made an unexpected move. He agreed to a live, unfiltered interview with one of the most respected investigative journalists in the country, Laura Williams. Known for her hard-hitting, no-nonsense approach, Laura was the last person to be swayed by flashy PR campaigns. If Clint could convince her, maybe he could convince the rest of the world. The interview was set to air in prime time, and Clint knew the stakes were high. This was his chance to speak directly to the public and expose everything, the manipulation, the lies, the faces behind the curtain. It was his opportunity to make them see the truth. Laura greeted Clint with a sharp handshake as he walked into the studio. Her eyes, a piercing blue, studied him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She wasn't there to be swayed by Clint's charm or his fame. She was there to get answers. "Clint, thank you for agreeing to sit down with me today," Lara said, her tone calm but firm. "This is a very controversial subject, and you've already faced a lot of backlash. But the question on everyone's mind is this: why now? Why are you choosing to speak out against these people?" Clint took a deep breath, his mind focused. This was the moment. He looked directly into Lara's eyes, knowing that what he said next would either make or break him. "Because the truth matters," Clint began. "For too long, people like me have been silenced. We've been pushed into the shadows by people with power, people who use their influence to control the narrative, to destroy lives. I'm not just fighting for myself anymore. I'm fighting for the people who don't have a voice, for the ones who've been crushed by this system." Lara nodded, leaning forward as she listened intently. "But Clint, many people still view your claims with skepticism. They say you're making baseless accusations against some of the most powerful figures in the industry. How do you respond to that?" Clint didn't hesitate. "I'm not making accusations, I'm telling the truth. I've seen the evidence. I've talked to the people who've been hurt. And I'm not going to let these people get away with it anymore. This isn't about money, or fame, or revenge. This is about accountability." The interview continued for over an hour, Clint pouring his heart out, explaining the intricate web of lies, the personal betrayals, and the far-reaching consequences of the actions of those who had tried to ruin him. As he spoke, Clint could feel the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore, he was speaking for everyone who had been wronged, everyone who had ever felt powerless. When the interview finally ended, Lara looked at Clint with respect. "Thank you for your time, Clint. I think the world will be paying attention to what you've said tonight." As Clint left the studio, he felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. The battle was far from over, but he had taken control. The world had heard his side of the story, and now, the truth was out there. But Clint knew that the fight ahead would be tougher than ever. The backlash would continue, the threats would escalate, and the stakes would keep rising. But one thing was certain: he wasn't backing down. The reckoning had begun. In the days that followed Clint's groundbreaking interview, the landscape shifted. The media was still buzzing with controversy, but something had changed in the air. The powerful forces trying to discredit Clint were rattled. The truth had a funny way of doing that. It had a way of turning the tables, of exposing weaknesses in even the strongest facades. Clint knew the fight wasn't over. Far from it. In fact, the battle was just beginning. But he also understood that the war for his reputation, and for justice, was one that couldn't be fought alone. He had allies, sure, his lawyer, Jason, and a small but growing group of whistleblowers who were willing to stand beside him. But Clint knew that in this game, the more support he could gather, the better. He needed to form alliances with those who had the power to push back against the media narrative and those in positions of influence who had been similarly targeted by the same corrupt forces. It was then that Clint received a surprising call from someone he hadn't heard from in years. His old friend, Robert Downey Jr., who had weathered his own battles in Hollywood, was on the other line. "Clint, my man," Robert's voice crackled through the speaker, filled with an unexpected warmth. "I saw that interview. You've got guts. More than I gave you credit for." Clint smiled. "You're one to talk. I remember the chaos that went down with you a few years back. You came out of it stronger than ever." "Well, let's just say I've learned a thing or two about how to handle the wolves in this business," Robert replied. "And you, my friend, you're not alone in this fight. There are more of us than you realize. I've got your back." Clint felt a wave of relief wash over him. Robert had been through the ringer, public scandals, personal demons, and the press trying to tear him apart. But he'd come out the other side, and now, he was offering his support. "That means more than you know, Robert," Clint said, his voice thick with gratitude. "It's good to know there are still some decent people in this industry. People who aren't afraid to speak the truth. Listen, Clint, I've been talking to some folks who've had enough of the same game you're playing. I'm not talking about the tabloids or the shady agents. I'm talking about real, influential people who see through all the smoke and mirrors. We're going to get together, form a network, and take the fight straight to them. Clint felt his heart race. A network? You think we can take on the entire system like that? Robert laughed. I don't think we can, Clint. I know we can. If you're in, I'll make the calls. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for everyone who's ever been shoved aside because they didn't fit the mold. And trust me, there are more people out there who want change. It's time to take down the powers that have been pulling the strings for too long. Clint was silent for a moment, considering Robert's words. This was bigger than just his own personal vendetta. It was about an entire system that needed to be overhauled, an industry that had silenced voices for too long, that had crushed dreams with its hunger for power and control. I'm in, Clint said finally, his voice steady with purpose. Let's do it. Over the next few weeks, Clint and Robert worked behind the scenes to pull together a coalition of former stars, whistleblowers, and industry professionals who had all experienced the darker side of Hollywood. People who had been silenced, ridiculed, and pushed aside for daring to speak up. These were the individuals who had the most to lose and the most to gain by joining the fight for truth. One afternoon, Clint met with the first of these allies, Uma Thurman. Uma had always been one of the most respected actresses in Hollywood, known for her striking performances and no-nonsense attitude. But behind the scenes, Uma had her own history of battling the system. A few years ago, she had been blacklisted after speaking out about unfair treatment of women in the industry, and she knew exactly what Clint was up against. I've been watching you, Clint, Uma said as they sat down in a quiet cafe, away from the prying eyes of the paparazzi. And I'll be honest, I wasn't sure at first. But now, after hearing your story, I'm convinced. This isn't just about you or me. It's about a whole culture of exploitation. Clint nodded. That's exactly it, Uma. I'm done playing by their rules. I'm done letting people like them control who gets to succeed and who gets crushed. We have to expose it all. Uma leaned forward, her expression fierce. Count me in. I know how hard this fight is going to be, but we can't just stand by anymore. We can't let them win. Clint could feel the momentum building. With each person they brought on board, the coalition grew stronger. People like Matthew McConaughey, Jodie Foster, and Brad Pitt, all of them had been victims of the same system that Clint was now determined to dismantle. They had been silenced, ridiculed, or ostracized by the industry, and now, they were ready to speak out. It was clear that the fight ahead was going to be long and exhausting. The powerful forces Clint was going up against weren't going to just fold. They would fight back with everything they had, money, media manipulation, and even threats. But Clint had something on his side that they couldn't fight against, the truth. As Clint stood with his newfound allies, ready to face the storm head-on, he couldn't help but feel a sense of empowerment. This was no longer just about one man's battle, it was a movement. A movement to take down an entire corrupt system. The tide was turning, and Clint knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But he also knew this, no matter how tough the fight got, he wouldn't be facing it alone. The following week, Clint made another bold move. He called a press conference, but this time, it wasn't just about him. He wasn't standing alone. He was standing with a united front, a coalition of actors, directors, and professionals who were ready to take down the powerful figures who had been controlling Hollywood for too long. The press conference was a game changer. With every new person who stepped up to the podium, the media's attention shifted. It wasn't just Clint Eastwood anymore. It was Uma Thurman, Robert Downey Jr., Brad Pitt, Jodie Foster, and a growing list of influential voices. Together, they were calling for transparency, for justice, and for an end to the unchecked power that had caused so much damage. For the first time, Clint felt the weight of what he had started. This wasn't just a personal crusade anymore. It was a movement, and it was only just getting started. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The media blitz after Clint's coalition press conference was unlike anything anyone could have anticipated. What had started as a solitary battle had turned into a full-scale war, with Clint Eastwood at the helm of an unlikely group of whistleblowers, former stars, and industry professionals who were ready to bring the fight to the corrupt system of Hollywood. The press was eating it up, at first, skeptical, but then, as the coalition grew, their attention shifted from sensational headlines to serious questions. And the questions were coming from the people Clint least expected, those who had been behind the scenes for years but had never spoken up. Journalists, industry insiders, even former publicists, all now looking at Clint's campaign in a new light. Clint was speaking with one such journalist, Lena Harris, late one evening in his office. Lena had been following Clint's case closely and was no stranger to the inner workings of Hollywood's machine. She had covered the careers of stars, the rise and fall of directors, and the web of power that controlled the industry. But this story was different. This wasn't just another scandal or breakdown of an actor's career. This was the story of an entire system that had been broken for years. "You've really made waves, Clint," Lena said, as she poured them both another round of coffee. "But you know that what comes next is going to cost. Are you ready for that?" Clint sat back, his fingers rubbing his temple. He knew exactly what she meant. The industry was about to come at him with everything it had, legal teams, PR stunts, and maybe even worse. These people wouldn't just roll over because a few stars had come out against them. They would fight back, and they would fight dirty. "I'm ready," Clint replied. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now. "I've already lost a lot. My reputation, my career, hell, even my peace of mind. But I'm not backing down. If this industry is as messed up as I think it is, then someone's gotta expose it. It might as well be me." Lena nodded, clearly impressed. She had followed Clint's career from his early days, watched him play iconic roles, and now here he was, fighting not just for his own redemption, but for something far bigger than himself. The reality of his journey had hit her, and she knew that he was in this for the long haul. "Just know, Clint," Lena continued, "this isn't going to be easy. The industry has a way of making people disappear. And I'm not talking about just your career. They'll make you question your every move. They'll make sure that no one takes you seriously. There's a price to speaking out, and it's not just fame or money. It's everything." Clint stared at her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "I've made peace with that," he said quietly. "But I'm not doing it alone. There are too many people who've been hurt by this, people who don't have a voice. I won't let them be silenced anymore." Lena studied Clint for a moment, her sharp eyes searching his face. "That's the truth, isn't it? You're not just in this for yourself." Clint didn't reply immediately. He didn't need to. Lena understood him in a way that few people did. She knew what this fight meant, not just for Clint, but for every person who had been crushed by the machine that ran Hollywood. As the weeks went by, Clint and his coalition continued to face mounting pressure. Legal battles were intensifying. Lawsuits flew in every direction. There were even reports of potential smear campaigns, whispers of people trying to sabotage Clint's every move. But Clint didn't flinch. He knew that the system was coming for him, but he also knew he had the truth on his side. One night, as Clint walked out of a courthouse after a particularly grueling day of depositions, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Brad Pitt. "We've got someone in the system who's ready to talk. They've got the goods on what's really been happening behind the scenes. Get ready for a game changer." Clint's heart raced as he read the message. Someone within the industry, someone who had been part of the machine, was ready to expose it all. This was the break they had been waiting for. Clint immediately called Brad. "Brad, tell me more," Clint said, his voice tight with anticipation. "We've been working on it for a while. There's someone on the inside, a producer, who's ready to spill everything. They've got access to documents, emails, even footage. It's all the stuff we've been looking for." Clint felt a surge of hope. This was it. This could be the key to unraveling the entire system. But at the same time, Clint knew that exposing this information wouldn't be easy. It would put everyone involved in danger. The producer wasn't just taking a risk, they were risking their entire career. "How do we get them to speak?" Clint asked, his mind racing through the possibilities. "Leave it to me," Brad replied. "I've got a few tricks up my sleeve." The next week, Clint and Brad met with the whistleblower in a secure location. It was an unassuming conference room at a nondescript hotel, the kind of place where no one would look twice. But inside, Clint could feel the weight of what was about to unfold. The producer, whose name Clint couldn't reveal yet, sat across from him, visibly nervous but determined. They were a seasoned industry veteran, someone who had worked with some of the biggest names in Hollywood. Their career was built on years of hard work and connections, but now, all of it was at risk. Clint leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "We need the truth. You've got it, and we're ready to go public. But you have to know that once this is out, there's no going back. Are you prepared for that?" The producer hesitated, their hands trembling slightly. "I know. But I can't stay silent anymore. I've seen too much, and I've helped cover up things I never should have. I've worked with people who are just as guilty as those Clint's been accusing. But I can't live with it. It's time for it to end." Clint nodded. "Then we do this together. And we make sure the truth gets out." As the meeting ended, Clint knew that things were about to escalate. This was the moment that could change everything. With the producer's information in hand, Clint and his allies had the ammunition they needed to bring down the system, piece by piece. But Clint also understood the cost. There was no turning back now. The enemy would fight harder, retaliate more viciously. The price of truth was steep, and Clint knew that in the coming days, he would have to pay it in full. The days after Clint's meeting with the whistleblower were a blur of activity. With the explosive new evidence from the insider, the coalition was set to make their move. Clint knew the time had come to take the fight to the very heart of the Hollywood machine. The producer, whose identity remained closely guarded, had supplied them with a treasure trove of evidence. Internal emails, financial documents, audio tapes, and even video footage, these were the keys to unraveling the twisted web of corruption that had been festering in Hollywood for decades. It was enough to bring down not just a few individuals, but an entire network of powerful people who had been manipulating the industry from the shadows. Clint sat in his office late one evening, reviewing the footage again. The gravity of what he was about to do wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just a story that would make headlines. It was a story that could change everything, the way Hollywood operated, the way people viewed their idols, the way the industry treated those who were vulnerable. His phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Jason, his lawyer. "Clint, I think we're ready," Jason said, his voice both urgent and relieved. "I've gone through the material with our legal team. We can't hold back anymore. We've got to make this public. And we've got to do it soon." Clint exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Once they went public with this, there was no turning back. "I know, Jason," Clint said, his voice resolute. "But once we do, they'll come for us. They'll come for me, and they'll come for everyone in this coalition. Are we ready for that?" "We've been ready, Clint," Jason replied. "You've been fighting for this moment for too long. Now it's time to stand firm." Clint knew Jason was right. He'd fought for too long to back down now. The time for whispers and behind-the-scenes maneuvering was over. It was time to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The following day, Clint gathered his coalition for an emergency meeting. The group, which now included some of the biggest names in Hollywood, Robert Downey Jr., Uma Thurman, Brad Pitt, and others, met at an undisclosed location. They were a tight-knit group, bound together not just by their shared experiences but by a collective resolve to bring about change. As Clint walked into the room, he felt the gravity of the moment. These were the people who had become his family, his brothers and sisters in arms. They were all in this together. "This is it," Clint said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "We have the evidence. We have everything we need to tear down the walls of this system. But it's going to get ugly. We can't afford to be scared now." Robert Downey Jr. stood up, his usual playful demeanor replaced with a rare seriousness. "Clint's right. We've all seen the cost of this fight, firsthand. But we've also seen what happens when we stay silent. If we don't do this now, we're letting them win. We're letting them keep destroying people's lives." Uma Thurman, her voice calm yet firm, added, "This isn't just about us. This is for the people who don't have the resources, the fame, or the influence to fight back. This is about making sure the next generation of stars doesn't fall into the same traps we did." Clint nodded. He knew what was at stake. He could feel it in his bones. "We take this public. We give the world the truth. And we hold nothing back. The good, the bad, the ugly. It all comes out." Brad Pitt, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "We do this together, Clint. No one is alone in this fight." With that, the decision was made. They would release the evidence. They would make the truth known to the world, no matter the consequences. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. The coalition's PR team worked around the clock, preparing for a coordinated media drop. Every major news outlet was contacted. The footage, the documents, the emails, all of it was carefully curated, ready to be unveiled. They had even secured interviews with key witnesses who were prepared to speak on the record. But Clint knew that once they pulled the trigger, there would be no turning back. The powerful figures who controlled Hollywood would do everything in their power to discredit them. They would turn the public against them, destroy their careers, and maybe even their lives. But Clint was no stranger to that kind of fight. He'd been up against tough odds his entire career. On the day of the release, Clint was sitting in front of a camera, surrounded by his allies. The press conference was scheduled for noon, but Clint had no illusions about what was going to happen. The industry would retaliate quickly and fiercely. They would attack, manipulate, and try to bury the truth. But Clint was ready for it. As the cameras began to roll, Clint took a deep breath. He looked directly into the lens, his face serious but calm. "Today, the truth comes to light," he began. "For too long, Hollywood has been a place where power, greed, and manipulation have reigned. It's a place where people are silenced, where dreams are crushed, and where the truth is buried under layers of deception. But no more. The time for change is now." With that, the coalition began releasing the documents and footage. The world watched in shock as the dam broke. Every major media outlet was flooded with the details of the corruption that had been allowed to fester in Hollywood for years. The footage showed actors being blacklisted, producers bribing studios for better deals, and agents coercing young stars into uncomfortable situations in exchange for career opportunities. The emails were damning, proof of collusion, backroom deals, and a culture of silence that had kept the truth hidden for far too long. And in the midst of it all, Clint Eastwood stood tall, his voice unwavering as he revealed his own personal experiences. He spoke of the manipulation he had endured, the times when his career had been on the line, and the battles he'd fought in the shadows, all to protect his own dignity. As the press conference ended, Clint knew that the world would never be the same. The floodgates had opened, and there was no going back. The people in power would fight to maintain their control, but Clint and his coalition had done what they set out to do, expose the truth. But as Clint walked off the stage, a new reality began to settle in. The war was far from over. The industry would retaliate. They would try to destroy everything he had worked for. But Clint was ready. He had his allies. He had the truth. And he would never stop fighting. The aftermath of Clint Eastwood's bold press conference hit the world like a tidal wave. The evidence was irrefutable, the revelations breathtaking, and the consequences immediate. Within hours, social media exploded, with hashtags like #ExposeHollywood and #TheTruthIsOut trending worldwide. Every news outlet scrambled to cover the story, and the flood of shocking details flooded headlines. Clint's coalition had hoped for this reaction, they had planned for it, but they hadn't fully grasped the force of what was to come. Hollywood was a world built on power and control, and now, those who had thrived on manipulation were losing that grip. But with every action, there is a counteraction. As Clint sat at his desk late that night, the weight of what he had done started to settle on him. He was no longer just Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director. He was Clint Eastwood, the man who had dared to challenge the very structure of Hollywood. The man who had thrown open the door to expose its darkest secrets. But even Clint had underestimated the ferocity of the industry's response. His phone rang. It was Jason, his lawyer. "Clint," Jason said, his voice tight, "it's already starting. The studios are calling in favors, pushing back. The smear campaigns are ramping up. We knew they would react, but it's happening faster than we expected." Clint leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He had known this would be hard. He'd expected retaliation. What he didn't expect was just how calculated, coordinated, and relentless the attack would be. "How bad is it?" Clint asked. "It's bad," Jason replied. "Your name is already being dragged through the mud. They're calling you a has-been, a washed-up actor who's bitter about the changes in Hollywood. They're questioning your motives, painting you as a man clinging to the past. Some of the articles are borderline libelous." Clint knew exactly what Jason meant. The industry had long relied on its media connections to craft narratives, controlling the stories, spinning the facts, and shaping public opinion. Now, those same forces were turning their attention on Clint, hoping to tear him down. But Clint wasn't about to back down. He had fought too long and too hard to let the noise from these corporate giants get to him. "We expected this," Clint said firmly. "But we've got something they don't, the truth. No amount of press can change that." The next few days were a whirlwind of damage control. Clint and his team had been prepared for some fallout, but they hadn't anticipated how quickly the industry would circle the wagons. Hollywood heavyweights like Steven Spielberg and Meryl Streep were rumored to have privately distanced themselves from Clint, while several industry influencers and powerful producers publicly denounced his actions, framing him as a man who had outlived his relevance. But it wasn't just about public shaming. Clint was being hit where it hurt most, his career. Deals that had once seemed secure were suddenly on the table for re-evaluation. Scripts that had been sent to him were now being pulled. Major studios were refusing to work with him, and calls from producers who had once been eager to collaborate with him ceased altogether. It was a well-coordinated attack on his professional life, a clear message that the industry had the power to erase anyone who dared to challenge it. And yet, Clint remained steadfast. Late one evening, as Clint sat with his closest allies, Brad Pitt, Robert Downey Jr., and Uma Thurman, the weight of their situation hit them all at once. "Are we ready for what's coming next?" Brad asked, his voice grave. He looked around the room at their battle-worn faces. "It's more than just Hollywood going after us," Robert replied, his hands clenched in determination. "This is a full-scale operation to destroy everything we've built. They'll use every tool at their disposal, legal, financial, and personal, to try and bury this. They can't let us win." Clint nodded, his expression stoic. But they can't stop the truth from coming out. We just have to outlast them. Uma leaned forward, her tone calm yet filled with a quiet resolve. Clint's right. We can't afford to lose hope now. We've already come this far. It's a fight we're in until the end, and we're all in this together. Clint looked around the room at his friends, his family in this fight. He had made a promise to them all, and to the millions of people who had been hurt by the system. There was no turning back. This was the moment that would define everything. We'll keep going, Clint said, his voice firm. We'll fight back. We'll be louder than they are. The weeks that followed were brutal. The media's attacks became more personal. Clint's personal life was under siege, with tabloids printing sensationalized stories about his past relationships and private moments. There were even claims that Clint's mental state was in decline, that the man who had once been Hollywood's golden boy had simply snapped under the pressure of age and obscurity. But Clint's resolve never wavered. If anything, the more the industry tried to tear him down, the more determined he became. He started pushing back, giving interviews, doing TV appearances, and continuing to advocate for the truth, even in the face of vicious retaliation. He wasn't just defending himself, he was defending the people who had been crushed by the very system he was fighting to expose. And with every interview, with every public appearance, Clint found his voice becoming stronger. The public, who had once questioned his motivations, were now rallying behind him. Messages of support flooded his social media accounts. Former colleagues and lesser-known figures in Hollywood reached out privately, thanking him for his bravery. People began to see the cracks in the industry's armor. But just as Clint began to feel the tide turning in his favor, the most dangerous blow came from an unexpected place, his own family. It started with a phone call from his estranged daughter, Clint Eastwood. She had stayed out of the spotlight for years, keeping a low profile away from the media's prying eyes. But now, she was thrust into the center of the storm, and it wasn't because of any decision she had made. It was because of Clint's very public battle. "Dad, what have you done?" Allison's voice came through the phone, full of frustration and concern. "You're risking everything. Our family, our name, is being dragged through the mud because of this. People are looking at us like we're all complicit. You've hurt the people who love you." Clint closed his eyes, feeling the sting of her words. He knew that his fight had come at a price, but hearing it from his own daughter made the weight of it all more real than ever before. "I'm not doing this to hurt you, Allison," Clint replied, his voice soft but steady. "I'm doing this because it's the right thing. And if that costs me my career, if it costs me even my family, then so be it. But I'm not backing down." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Allison spoke again. I don't know if I can stand by you on this," she said quietly, before hanging up the phone. Clint stared at his phone, a deep sense of loss settling in his chest. He had sacrificed so much for this fight, but the one thing he had never wanted to lose was the love and support of his family. Yet, here he was, facing the reality that his choices might have irreparably damaged the one thing he had tried to protect. The war against Clint Eastwood was escalating at a rapid pace, and he could feel it in his bones. The backlash from Hollywood had only intensified after the release of the explosive evidence, but there were unexpected shifts taking place. Not all the news was negative. While Clint was under siege by many of his former colleagues, others began to come forward in support of his efforts. The phone calls from new allies were steady, though they came with a whisper of caution. Some were reluctant to publicly throw their weight behind Clint, given the high stakes. But Clint's resolve remained unshaken. He had always known that those who sought real change would eventually find their courage, and that was starting to happen. The first sign of a shift came from George Clooney, who had stayed out of the limelight after Clint's initial press conference. A private message appeared in Clint's inbox one morning, simply reading, "I'm with you. Call me." Clint had never been particularly close to Clooney, but they shared mutual respect for one another's work. George was a seasoned actor and director who had built a reputation for both his humanitarian efforts and his unyielding stance on personal integrity. If Clooney was willing to speak out, it would undoubtedly add weight to Clint's fight. Clint didn't waste time. He picked up the phone and dialed the number. "Clint, it's George," came the voice on the other end. "I didn't expect to hear from you," Clint replied, surprised yet relieved. "But I'm glad you called. I've been watching everything unfold, and I can't stay silent anymore," George said, his tone resolute. "What they're doing to you is exactly what they've done to so many others over the years. We can't let them get away with this, Clint. I'm with you, and I'll help however I can." Clint let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It wasn't just a message of support, it was a promise of solidarity. "Thanks, George. That means more than you know. We'll need all the help we can get." With Clooney's support, the coalition gained even more momentum. Clint reached out to other figures in Hollywood who had remained on the sidelines, urging them to join the fight. Slowly but surely, more and more stars began to step out of the shadows and take a stand. But for every ally that came forward, there were just as many powerful enemies who doubled down on their attacks. Clint's phone rang again, this time from Meryl Streep, one of the few major figures who had initially voiced her opposition to Clint's public exposure of Hollywood's corruption. Streep had long been a champion for social change, and her reputation had made her a beloved figure in the industry. Her position, however, had always been one of cautious diplomacy. "Clint, I need to talk to you," Meryl said, her voice tinged with a sense of urgency. "I've been thinking about everything you've uncovered. I see now what you were trying to do, but it's becoming clear that this could destroy everything we've built over the years. It's not just about Hollywood anymore. You're shaking the very foundation of an entire system." Clint didn't flinch. He knew that many in Hollywood who were once on the fence were beginning to question their allegiances as the fight grew more intense. "I know this isn't easy, Meryl," Clint said. "But it's the only way. If we stay silent, nothing changes. Nothing ever changes. We have to be willing to sacrifice something if we want to make a difference. And if we don't do it now, we'll never have the chance again." Meryl sighed. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I know you're right. But Clint, be careful. This is going to get worse. You don't just make enemies in Hollywood, you make enemies in high places. And when those people come for you, they don't stop." Clint knew that all too well. He had seen it happen before, not just in Hollywood, but in the broader world of power and corruption. "I know what I'm getting into, Meryl. And I'm ready." "I'll help," Meryl said quietly. "But you've got to be prepared for what's coming next." In the days that followed, Clint's network of allies began to grow stronger. New voices emerged, and the media landscape shifted as well. However, the other side was equally organized. The resistance wasn't only coming from studios and powerful producers, it was also coming from the legal side. The lawsuits began rolling in. The first lawsuit hit Clint like a sledgehammer. It wasn't a simple defamation suit, this was a multifaceted attack, one designed to overwhelm him both financially and emotionally. It accused Clint of everything from spreading false information to intentionally sabotaging the careers of those he had exposed. The sheer scope of it was meant to drain Clint's resources and force him into a corner. But Clint refused to cower. If anything, the lawsuits only strengthened his resolve. The pressure was mounting, but he knew this was exactly what the other side wanted, to wear him down, to make him feel like retreating was the only option. And Clint wasn't the only one under attack. His allies were being targeted too. Uma Thurman, who had been one of the staunchest supporters of Clint's cause, found herself in the midst of a media firestorm. The tabloids painted her as a troublemaker, a woman who had gone rogue in Hollywood. News outlets questioned her professional decisions, accusing her of being too radical in her push for change. "I knew this would happen," Uma said when Clint called her to check in. Her voice was strained, but her determination was unwavering. "They're going after us all, Clint. But we can't stop now." "We won't," Clint said, his voice resolute. "They can throw whatever they want at us. We've got the truth on our side, and that's all we need." But even in the darkest moments, Clint could feel a subtle shift. The backlash, while powerful, wasn't as overwhelming as it had seemed. The people who had been silenced for years, those who had suffered in silence, were beginning to find their voices. They weren't going to let Hollywood sweep this under the rug. One evening, Clint found himself at a small gathering with some of his most trusted allies, Uma, Robert, and George. They were talking strategy, figuring out their next move, when the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't just the tension from their situation. There was something else. Something larger. "We're not just fighting for Hollywood anymore," George Clooney said, his voice low but steady. "We're fighting for the truth. We're fighting for everyone who's ever been silenced, pushed aside, or exploited. We're fighting for change." The room fell silent as everyone processed George's words. Clint looked around at his allies, his family, and felt the weight of what they were undertaking. It wasn't just about breaking Hollywood. It was about breaking an entire system of power that extended far beyond the industry. What they were doing now would change the course of history. The world was watching. Clint Eastwood's fight against the entrenched Hollywood power structure had become the story of the moment. The media was in overdrive, constantly covering the latest developments, each headline seeming more explosive than the last. On one hand, Clint had gained support from some of the industry's biggest stars. On the other, a well-organized campaign to discredit him was pushing back harder than ever. But despite all the chaos and noise, Clint held fast. He knew that every movement in this battle had a purpose, each step leading him closer to something bigger. Clint sat alone in his office late one evening, the soft glow of his desk lamp the only light in the otherwise dark room. He'd been reading through some of the latest articles, and the smear campaign was starting to hit him hard. His face was plastered across the pages of tabloids, not for his acting accomplishments or groundbreaking direction, but for the drama that had taken over his life. And yet, the headlines painted him as a villain, the man who was trying to destroy the industry he once helped shape. Clint leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling. He had no illusion that this battle was going to be easy. It was never about making things smooth, it was about making things right. And no matter how much the world tried to tear him down, he couldn't walk away now. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," Clint called, and the door creaked open. It was Brad Pitt, his trusted ally and longtime friend. Brad stepped in, a concerned look on his face, holding a file in his hands. "I've got some news," Brad said, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "The lawsuit's been filed. They're targeting not just you, but the whole coalition. They're trying to bankrupt us, Clint. The numbers they're throwing at us are astronomical." Clint didn't flinch. He knew it was coming. The attacks were no longer just about the media, now, they were hitting him where it hurt the most, his resources. "They're trying to crush us," Clint said, his voice firm, "but they don't understand that we're not doing this for money. We're doing this for the people who can't speak up. We're doing this because it's the right thing." Brad nodded but his expression remained grim. "I know. But the pressure's mounting. The studios are pulling out, the networks are refusing to cover us, and the public's perception is starting to shift. If we don't act quickly, we might lose this momentum." Clint's mind raced, but his expression remained calm. "What's the next step?" Brad opened the file and slid it across the desk to Clint. "We've been working on this, getting people to rally behind us. There's a plan in the works for a huge media push. We're going to need to hit back harder." Clint picked up the file and studied the contents. It was a detailed strategy, one that would involve pushing back against the lawsuits with counterclaims and rallying public support with a high-profile, televised interview. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was Clint's last chance to seize control of the narrative. "We do this, we go all in," Clint said, determination lacing his words. "If they want a fight, they'll get it." Over the next few days, the coalition worked tirelessly to prepare for the media blitz. Clint was set to sit down for an exclusive interview with David Letterman, the man who had famously not shied away from difficult subjects. It was a move that had been planned for weeks, but now, it felt like the last card Clint had to play. The spotlight would be on him once again, but this time, it wouldn't be for Hollywood's grand spectacle. It would be to speak the truth. The night before the interview, Clint sat in his hotel room, reflecting on everything that had led him here. He wasn't just a man trying to salvage his career anymore. He was a man on a mission. There were thousands, maybe millions, of people who had been silenced, ignored, or crushed under the weight of the system Clint was trying to expose. As Clint sat by the window, looking out at the glowing city below, he realized just how far he had come. And how far he still had to go. The following afternoon, Clint arrived at the studio where the interview would take place. He was met by a whirlwind of activity, producers, camera crews, staff running back and forth, preparing for what was expected to be one of the most anticipated interviews in years. Clint was no stranger to the media spotlight, but this time, it felt different. This wasn't about promoting a film or a new project. This was about speaking the truth, his truth, and he was ready. As Clint walked into the green room, he saw David Letterman waiting for him. Letterman was legendary for his sharp wit, and Clint had always admired his fearless approach to tough conversations. "You ready for this, Clint?" David asked, his eyes twinkling with that familiar mischief. Clint gave a half-smile. "Ready as I'll ever be, Dave." They exchanged a few pleasantries before the cameras started rolling. The audience settled into their seats, and the lights dimmed. The segment began with David introducing Clint, and then the questions started. "So, Clint," David began, his tone casual, "you've been making headlines for quite some time now. You've exposed a lot of ugly truths about the industry, and frankly, a lot of people aren't happy about it. What made you decide to go public with all of this?" Clint's eyes locked onto the camera as he spoke, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I didn't do it for the headlines. I didn't do it to make myself a target. I did it because the truth matters. Hollywood, for far too long, has protected the people who've hurt others. People who've exploited, manipulated, and controlled, people who've made millions at the expense of others. The time for silence is over." David leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "But Clint, this isn't just about Hollywood, is it? This is bigger than that, right?" Clint nodded. "Yes. Hollywood is just the beginning. This system of power, it's everywhere. But it's been built on lies, and it's time to tear it down. People deserve to know the truth. We've all been complicit by staying silent for too long. But now, we can't afford to stay quiet any longer." The interview lasted nearly an hour, and Clint laid bare the realities of the industry, its manipulation, exploitation, and systematic abuse of power. He didn't hold back, but he wasn't angry. He was calm, resolute, and incredibly precise in every word he spoke. It wasn't just a media moment. It was a call to action. By the end of the interview, it was clear to everyone watching that Clint Eastwood had become more than just a figurehead in Hollywood. He had become the voice for those who had never had one. As Clint walked off the stage, his mind was already racing ahead, thinking about the next steps. The media push had been successful, now it was time to turn the momentum into real change. There was still so much work to do, but Clint knew one thing for sure: they had just taken the first true step toward breaking the system. The night after the Letterman interview, Clint couldn't sleep. The room felt suffocating, even though the air conditioner hummed softly in the background. He lay in bed, his mind racing over everything that had just happened. The interview had gone better than he expected, he had made his case clear, and the public response had been overwhelmingly supportive. But Clint knew better than to get comfortable. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. The backlash, as expected, came swiftly. By morning, there were articles questioning Clint's motives, his past, even his integrity. Some said he was simply trying to deflect attention from his waning career, while others accused him of using his platform for personal gain. The narrative was shifting again, and Clint could feel the weight of it all. But what bothered him more than the public criticism was the internal struggle he now faced. He had made his choice, he was in this fight for the long haul. But the reality of that choice was hitting him harder than ever. Every decision, every move from here on out, would either make or break his mission. This was no longer just about exposing the ugly truths of Hollywood. This was about confronting his own past, his own choices, and the consequences of the career he had built. Clint's phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. He grabbed it off the bedside table, surprised to see the caller ID. It was George Clooney. "Clint, we need to talk," George's voice crackled through the speaker, urgency clear in his tone. "Yeah, sure. What's going on?" Clint replied, sitting up in bed. "They're circling, Clint. The studios, hell, the entire industry, they're circling like vultures. I heard rumors that some people want to take you down by any means necessary. The pressure is building." Clint's stomach tightened. "What kind of pressure are we talking about?" "The kind that comes with millions on the line," George said. "I'm talking about heavy hitters, people who have the power to destroy you. And not just your career, your personal life, your reputation, everything." Clint ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling inside him. He had expected something like this. He had been a part of the Hollywood system long enough to know how it worked. But hearing George's words made it feel all the more real. "I won't back down, George," Clint said firmly. "I can't. This is bigger than just me." "I know," George replied, his voice softening. "But I'm telling you, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Be ready." Clint hung up the phone, his thoughts a whirlwind. He had already made it this far, but now the stakes were higher than ever. He had been a part of a system that silenced the truth for decades. Now, that same system was coming for him. A few days later, Clint found himself at a crossroads. The coalition was growing stronger with each passing day. Uma, Brad, and Meryl were all on board, but they were beginning to feel the pressure as well. Hollywood was a tight-knit world, and those who had once supported Clint were now questioning whether they should continue risking their own careers for the sake of a fight that seemed increasingly impossible to win. Clint sat at a small table in a downtown cafe, nursing a cup of black coffee. The sound of muted conversations and clinking cups surrounded him, but his mind was elsewhere. He was alone for the moment, but he wasn't truly alone. Every decision he made from here on out would affect not just him, but everyone who had backed him, everyone who had come to his side. He had always been a lone wolf in Hollywood. That had served him well for much of his life. But this? This was different. This wasn't about fame or accolades. This was about something far more important, integrity. And Clint couldn't ignore the growing sense that, despite the swelling support from allies, there was a part of him that wasn't sure how long he could keep going. He was starting to feel the cracks forming. The emotional toll was high, and the constant attacks, both public and private, were wearing him down. Suddenly, the door to the cafe opened, and Meryl Streep walked in. She spotted Clint immediately and made her way over to his table. She sat down across from him, her expression serious. "I didn't want to say anything over the phone," Meryl said quietly, "but I've been getting calls. The pressure is getting to everyone. People are starting to question whether we should pull back before it's too late." Clint looked at her, his face unreadable. He had suspected this was coming. He had been hearing the same whispers in the industry. But hearing it from Meryl, someone he respected deeply, stung. "You know, Clint," Meryl continued, "we can only do so much. Hollywood is bigger than any of us. They have the power to ruin lives, to bury careers. And if we keep pushing this, it's going to destroy us. Clint felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice calm. I understand, Meryl. But this isn't about just one person. It's about changing everything. If we stop now, we're letting them win. We can't let that happen. Meryl's eyes softened, but she didn't back down. I know. But we can't ignore the reality of the situation. If we go forward, we have to be prepared for the consequences. The industry won't just sit back and let us expose its secrets without a fight. And it's not just Hollywood, there are powerful people involved who won't hesitate to make us pay. Clint looked out the window, his mind racing. Meryl was right. He had known from the start that this wasn't going to be easy. But hearing it so bluntly from her made it feel more real than ever. You're right, Clint said finally, his voice a low murmur. But I can't back down. I made a promise, to myself, and to everyone who's been silenced. We have to finish this. Meryl sat back in her chair, watching him. Then you better be prepared for what's coming, Clint. Because it's not just the industry you're up against. It's the entire system that's built to protect the powerful and crush the ones who speak out. And they'll stop at nothing. As Clint walked out of the cafe, he felt the weight of Meryl's words. She had always been the voice of reason, but this time, she wasn't trying to discourage him. She was trying to warn him. Clint's phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a new message from Brad Pitt. It was short, but it carried an unmistakable urgency. We've got a meeting tonight. Be there. This could change everything. Later that evening, Clint arrived at the designated meeting spot, an old, discreet private office tucked away in a quiet part of town. Brad, Uma, and George were already there, sitting around a table, their faces serious. We've got an option, Brad said as Clint sat down. We've been approached by a couple of high-profile figures in the legal world, people who want to help us fight back. They have the resources to go after the studios, but it's going to require us to go all in. We'll need to be prepared for a battle that could last for years. Clint's heart raced. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The fight would continue, but the stakes were higher than ever. I'm in, Clint said, his voice steady. Let's finish what we started. The morning sun streamed through the blinds of Clint's hotel room, casting long shadows on the floor. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at his phone, the screen glowing with messages and news alerts. There was no peace in the silence that followed Meryl's warning. His thoughts were racing, not just over the stakes of the fight ahead, but over the personal costs of all this. Would he make it out unscathed? Would anyone? He shook his head, trying to push the doubts away. He had committed to this fight, and backing out now wasn't an option. The industry had built walls to keep people like him silent for years. But now, those walls were starting to crumble. And Clint was determined to bring the whole thing down, brick by brick. It wasn't long before Clint found himself back in the familiar world of private meetings and hushed conversations. The coalition of actors and allies had grown stronger in the past few days. Uma Thurman, Brad Pitt, and George Clooney were all on board, but the tension in the air was palpable. Everyone knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. But the willingness to stand up for what was right was growing, even among those who had once stayed silent. The four of them gathered in a small, private office in a building tucked away from the public eye. The room was dimly lit, and a large, wooden table sat at the center. The atmosphere was heavy, each person aware of the magnitude of the moment. We've received some serious offers, Clint, George began, his voice low but steady. There are a few influential people who want to help us with the legal side. They believe in what we're doing. But they're not doing this for free. There's a price to pay. Clint nodded slowly, knowing what George meant. There were always strings attached. Nothing in Hollywood came without a price. But he wasn't in this for fame or fortune anymore. He was in it for the truth. What kind of price? Clint asked, his voice steady but with a hint of wariness. The kind that makes people rethink their entire lives, Brad replied, his eyes meeting Clint's. We're talking about exposure, big-time exposure. If we go this route, everything will be out in the open. The good, the bad, the ugly. Nothing will be left in the dark. Clint took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had already made the commitment to expose Hollywood's ugly truths. But now the stakes were higher. If they went public, there would be no going back. Uma leaned forward, her expression grave. We've been doing this quietly, getting the information, building the case. But now, we have to decide if we're ready to take it all to the press. Are we ready for the world to know the full extent of what's been happening in this industry? Clint's eyes met hers. This was the moment of truth. He knew they couldn't turn back. Not now. Not after everything they'd already uncovered. The power of Hollywood was at its peak, and it was time to show the world just how deep the corruption ran. We're ready, Clint said, his voice unwavering. Let's do it. The next few weeks passed in a blur. The team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, preparing everything they needed for the big reveal. Documents were gathered, witnesses were prepped, and every move was calculated. But Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The higher-ups had to know what they were planning. It was only a matter of time before the retaliation came. One afternoon, while Clint was going over some final details with Brad, George, and Uma, a news alert flashed across his phone. His stomach dropped as he read the headline, Clint Eastwood accused of corruption by former associates, allegations emerge from secret tapes. The article went on to describe a scandal that Clint had never even heard of. The so-called tapes were said to contain incriminating evidence that Clint had been involved in a scheme to sabotage up-and-coming actors for years. The claims were bold, and the sources anonymous. Clint stared at the screen in disbelief. This wasn't just an attack on his character. It was an attempt to destroy everything he had worked for. George's voice broke through the silence. This is the first shot across the bow. They know we're getting close. We have to move faster, Clint. If we don't act now, they'll bury us. Clint's mind was racing. He had expected the fight to get dirty, but this was worse than he had anticipated. The lies, the manipulation, they were already trying to turn the public against him. But Clint wasn't about to back down. Let them say what they want, Clint said, his voice hardening. We know the truth. And we're going to make sure everyone else does, too. The following days were a whirlwind of legal battles, media chaos, and mounting pressure. Clint could feel the tension building as they prepared to launch their full-scale campaign. The industry, once a machine that had served him, was now his biggest enemy. And it was doing everything it could to stop him. Despite the pressure, Clint found moments of solace in his conversations with his closest allies. Uma, Brad, and George were all in the same boat. They had each given up something significant to stand by him. But their resolve was unwavering. They knew the fight would be long, and they knew the risks, but they were committed. Together, they were stronger. Clint sat in his hotel room late one night, reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. The road to this moment hadn't been easy, but he had always been someone who thrived in the face of adversity. He had spent decades carving out a place for himself in Hollywood, but now he was fighting for something bigger. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had been silenced, every voice that had been crushed by the system. He took a deep breath and picked up his phone, dialing the number he had been avoiding for days. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Clint, Meryl said, her voice calm but with an edge of concern. What's happening? Are you okay? Clint exhaled slowly. I'm fine, Meryl. But things are about to get real. I need you to be ready. It's happening, soon. Meryl's silence on the other end was heavy. I knew it was coming. Just, be careful, Clint. This isn't a game anymore. I know, Clint said softly. But I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever. As the days ticked down to their public reveal, Clint's resolve only hardened. The calm before the storm was ending. The world was about to learn the truth about Hollywood. The battle was far from over, but Clint was ready for whatever came next. He had no choice. He had already stepped into the ring, and he was determined to see it through to the end. The weight of the storm was starting to take its toll on Clint. Days blurred into nights, and the pressure only seemed to mount. He had always been someone who thrived under tension, but this was different. This wasn't about making a movie or surviving a bad review, it was about his very soul, his reputation, his legacy. Every move he made was being watched, scrutinized, and twisted by those who wanted to see him fail. The coalition of allies Clint had built was strong, but even the strongest alliances have their breaking points. It was one afternoon, as Clint sat in his office, reviewing documents for the upcoming press release, that he received a phone call that would change everything. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Clint, the voice said, cool and calculated, we need to talk. Clint's blood ran cold. It was Matt Damon, one of his closest friends in Hollywood. They had worked together on several films over the years, sharing countless hours on set. But there was something in Matt's voice that felt off, distant, almost cold. What's going on, Matt? Clint asked, trying to keep his voice steady. I think it's time we had an honest conversation, Matt replied, his tone sharper now. I've been hearing a lot of rumors, things that don't sit right with me. And I think you need to know the truth. Clint's stomach tightened. What rumors? Matt paused for a moment before responding, the tension between them palpable. There's been a leak, Clint. Something big. Someone close to you has been talking to the studios, feeding them information. The press release is about to drop, but the damage has already been done. You're going to be the one blamed for it all. Clint's mind raced. He could feel the walls closing in. He had always trusted the people around him, but now, the idea that someone in his inner circle had betrayed him was too much to fathom. Who? Clint's voice was low, almost a whisper. I don't know yet, but it's someone you wouldn't expect, Matt said. Someone who's been playing both sides. Clint's heart sank. He had never been naive about the games people played in Hollywood. But this felt different. Someone was actively working against him, and the worst part was, Clint couldn't figure out who it was. That night, Clint gathered his closest allies, George, Uma, Brad, and Meryl, in a private room at a secure location. The atmosphere was heavy, each person sensing the gravity of the conversation that was about to unfold. I don't know who we can trust anymore, Clint said, his voice tinged with frustration. He paced the room, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Meryl was the first to speak. We need to stay focused, Clint. Whoever's behind this, whatever's happening, we can't let it stop us. This fight is too important. Clint looked at her, his eyes searching hers. But what if we're wrong? What if we've been trusting the wrong people this whole time? Brad spoke next, his voice firm. You can't let paranoia win. We've been through too much to back down now. But Clint's mind was elsewhere, still wrestling with the betrayal that was now festering in his mind. Someone in this room is feeding them information, he muttered, almost to himself. Uma's face tightened, her jaw set. You're not seriously suggesting one of us? I don't know who to trust, Clint replied, the frustration and uncertainty in his voice unmistakable. Matt called me today. He says someone close to me has been talking to the studios, feeding them info. The room fell silent. Each person exchanged wary glances, the realization that they were all suspects hanging heavy in the air. "This is insane," George said, his voice low. "We've all been on the same side. Why would anyone here do that?" "Because they want to protect themselves," Clint replied bitterly. "We're all in this together, but Hollywood doesn't play fair. Someone is playing both sides, and it's only a matter of time before they tear us apart." The next few days were filled with tension. Clint couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in the privacy of his own home. The industry was closing in, and with every passing hour, the sense of betrayal loomed larger. As Clint's investigation into the leak continued, he grew increasingly paranoid. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the people who had been by his side for years. But despite his growing mistrust, Clint knew one thing for sure: he couldn't back down now. The fight for Hollywood's soul had become personal. Whoever was betraying him wouldn't stop him from his mission. He would expose the truth, no matter what. One evening, as Clint was walking through the quiet streets near his hotel, he received another phone call. This time, it was from Brad. "We need to meet," Brad said urgently. "Something's come up." Clint agreed, and within an hour, the two of them met in a secluded park. As Clint arrived, he saw Brad standing near a bench, looking over his shoulder with a wary glance. "What's going on?" Clint asked, his voice laced with impatience. Brad's face was pale. "We've found the leak. It's Uma." Clint froze, his mind racing. "What? Are you sure?" "I don't have all the details yet, but the evidence is clear. Uma has been in contact with the studios. She's been feeding them information about everything we've been working on, everything we've uncovered." "I'm sorry, Clint, but I had to tell you." Clint stood motionless, the weight of the betrayal sinking in. Uma had been one of the first to stand by him in this fight. To think that she had been playing both sides felt like a knife to the heart. "I can't believe it," Clint whispered. "She was one of the first to believe in this. How could she?" Brad shrugged. "People have their reasons. And in Hollywood, loyalty is a currency. Sometimes, it's worth more than truth." Clint stared at the ground, struggling to process everything. This wasn't just a betrayal of trust, it was a complete collapse of everything he had believed in. That night, Clint confronted Uma. She didn't deny it. In fact, she seemed almost relieved that the truth had come out. She admitted that the pressure had been too much for her to bear. The stakes had been raised, and she had found herself cornered, forced to choose between her loyalty to Clint and her fear of the consequences. "I never wanted to hurt you," Uma said, her voice soft but resigned. "But you have to understand, Clint, this isn't just a fight for you. It's a fight for all of us. And sometimes, we have to make hard choices." Clint shook his head. "You should have come to me. We could have figured this out together." "But I couldn't risk it," she said quietly. "I thought I was helping you, but I wasn't. I thought I could save myself by getting ahead of it." Clint's heart broke, but he knew there was no going back. The betrayal had cut too deep. "I can't trust you anymore," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. As Clint walked away from Uma, the weight of her betrayal hung heavy on him. He had lost a friend, but more importantly, he had lost trust in the very system he was trying to change. The road ahead was more uncertain than ever, but one thing was clear: he had to keep moving forward. No matter the cost. The aftermath of the betrayal weighed heavily on Clint. Uma's words echoed in his mind long after their confrontation. She had been a friend, someone he had trusted completely, and yet, in a moment of weakness and fear, she had turned against him. The sting of that betrayal cut deeper than any public scandal, but Clint had no choice but to press on. He knew that the stakes had changed. The public wasn't just watching to see if he could expose Hollywood's darkest secrets, they were now watching to see if he could recover from this blow. Could Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, the hero on screen, survive the chaos that had consumed his life? The leak had already done its damage. The press had spun the narrative, painting Clint as a figure willing to sell out his friends for the sake of his own ambitions. The headlines were brutal, the accusations damning. Every day brought a new scandal, a new twist in the story that seemed to be spiraling out of control. But Clint was no stranger to adversity. He had faced battles before, both on screen and off, and he wasn't about to let this one defeat him. Clint's team worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, preparing his response, and planning his next move. Brad, George, and Merrill were by his side, helping him to keep his focus. They were in this together, and they knew that if Clint was going to win, he needed their unwavering support. "We need to control the narrative," Brad said one evening, pacing in Clint's hotel suite. "If we let them define this, we'll lose. But if we get ahead of the story, we can turn this around." Clint nodded, his jaw clenched. "I don't care about the story anymore. I care about the truth. The people need to know what's really been going on behind closed doors. They need to see Hollywood for what it truly is." Merrill placed a hand on Clint's shoulder. "And they will. But we have to be smart about this. You've been in the public eye for decades. We can't let one mistake, one betrayal, ruin everything you've worked for. We need to hit them with the truth, but we need to do it carefully." George, who had been silent up until now, spoke up. "The truth is a powerful weapon, Clint. But we need to make sure we're not handing them ammunition. If we reveal everything all at once, it could backfire." Clint stood up, his posture rigid. "We reveal everything. We expose them for the corrupt, manipulative monsters they are. No more half measures. No more playing nice." The room fell silent as everyone processed his words. Clint's resolve was clear. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore, it was about taking down the system that had exploited him and countless others. The plan was set into motion. Over the next few days, Clint's legal team worked around the clock to prepare the documents, the evidence, and the testimonies that would bring the truth to light. Brad, George, and Merrill worked with journalists who were sympathetic to their cause, making sure the right stories were told. The media frenzy was intense, but Clint refused to back down. He was ready to face the consequences, whatever they might be. Then, one morning, the press release was ready. It was bold. It was raw. It was a direct challenge to everything Hollywood had built. The statement accused the studios of exploiting their actors, controlling their careers, and manipulating the public for profit. It called out specific individuals who had been complicit in the system, naming names, providing evidence, and laying bare the corrupt practices that had been hidden for years. And it included a promise: Clint would no longer be a part of that world. He was done. Clint knew that releasing the statement would change everything. He was about to set the world on fire, but he wasn't afraid. He was ready. The moment the press release went live, the world erupted. News outlets across the globe picked up the story. Social media exploded with hashtags like #HollywoodExposed and #ClintFightsBack. The backlash was immediate, but so was the support. Fans, fellow actors, and even some studio insiders came forward, applauding Clint for his bravery and for telling the truth. But the studios weren't going to take this lying down. Within hours, the spin began. They attacked Clint's character, calling his statements a smear campaign. They painted him as a washed-up actor desperate for attention, a man who was trying to tear down the very industry that had made him a star. Clint expected the attack. He knew it was coming. But what he didn't expect was the coordinated effort to discredit him, an effort that involved his own friends and colleagues. The word came from inside the industry. People who had once stood by him were now backing away, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. One by one, the names on Clint's list of allies began to fade. Some of his closest friends, people who had worked with him for years, issued statements distancing themselves from him. The pressure was mounting, and even those who had supported him were now wondering if it was worth the risk. The worst blow came when Clint received a message from Matt Damon. Matt had been one of Clint's closest confidants, and their friendship had been forged through years of hard work and shared experiences. But now, Matt was asking for Clint's forgiveness. He had made a deal with the studios to ensure his own career survived the fallout. "I'm sorry, Clint," Matt's voice crackled through the phone. "I never wanted to hurt you. But I had to make a choice. I couldn't risk losing everything. I hope you understand." Clint's heart sank as he listened to Matt's voice. It was as if the entire world had turned its back on him. He had always known that Hollywood was a cutthroat business, but he had never imagined it would come to this. "You chose them over me," Clint said quietly, his voice barely audible. "You chose your career over doing what was right." "I didn't have a choice," Matt pleaded. "You don't understand the pressure. They've got a hold on everyone, Clint. It's not just about you. It's about all of us. I'm sorry." The line went silent. Clint's grip on his phone tightened. He had always admired Matt, had always trusted him. But now, the truth was clear, Hollywood's power structure was bigger than any of them. And it was tearing them apart. That night, Clint sat alone in his hotel room, the weight of everything he had just learned pressing down on him. The betrayal, the lies, the media circus, it was all too much to bear. But in the quiet of the room, one thought kept repeating in his mind: he couldn't stop now. This wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about exposing the truth. About standing up for the people who had been silenced. About ensuring that the next generation of actors wouldn't have to suffer the same fate. Clint knew that the battle was far from over. The public reckoning was just the beginning. But as the sun set outside his window, he realized something else: he had finally taken control of his own narrative. And no matter what happened next, that was something no one could ever take away from him. Clint sat in the solitude of his penthouse suite, the harsh morning light spilling across the polished wood floors. His mind raced, caught between the whirlwind of public backlash and the mounting pressure from all sides. With each passing hour, the world seemed to close in, and every move he made felt like a step further into the unknown. His legal team had cautioned him against acting too impulsively, but Clint had always been one to trust his instincts, no matter how dire the situation seemed. The media had picked apart his every word, dissecting his statement and twisting it into something unrecognizable. The once revered icon was now being painted as a pariah, a man fighting against a system he had helped build. The betrayal from his friends, particularly Matt Damon, stung worse than anything the press could throw at him. Clint had trusted Matt, considered him a brother in arms, and yet here they were, miles apart, both standing on opposite sides of an invisible line that separated loyalty from self-preservation. But just as the weight of it all seemed unbearable, Clint received an unexpected phone call that would shift everything. It was an unassuming number on the caller ID, one that Clint didn't immediately recognize. Hesitant, he answered. "Clint." The voice on the other end was firm, but there was a sense of urgency in it that immediately caught his attention. "This is Julia Roberts." Clint leaned back in his chair, his heart racing. Julia Roberts was one of the few people in Hollywood Clint had always admired, not only for her acting but for her ability to stand her ground in an industry rife with manipulation. They had shared the screen in the past, but they weren't exactly close friends. Still, Clint had a deep respect for her, and the fact that she was calling him now felt like a sign. "Julia," Clint replied, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of surprise. "What's going on?" "I need to talk to you," she said, her tone low. "And I need you to listen carefully." Clint's curiosity piqued. "I'm listening." "I know you're in the middle of all this chaos," Julia began. "And I don't know if this will make things easier or harder, but I want you to know what you're going through right now. It's not just about you. It's about all of us. Hollywood's been corrupt for a long time. It's been built on lies, power plays, and exploitation. You're not the only one who's been hurt by it. Clint's grip tightened on the phone, his heart pounding. He had heard rumors over the years, but hearing it from someone like Julia, someone so firmly embedded in Hollywood, gave his words weight. "What are you saying, Julia?" he asked, his voice guarded. "Are you telling me you're on my side?" Julia paused, her breath audible through the phone. "I've been watching you, Clint. I've been watching everything unfold. And you're right about one thing, the system is broken. But it's not just the studios we need to take down. It's everyone who's complicit. I've been complicit too." Clint's brow furrowed in disbelief. "What do you mean?" "I've kept my mouth shut for years, Clint," Julia admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I've played along with the system because it was safe. I kept my head down and went with the flow. But watching what's happening to you, it changed everything. If you're willing to expose the truth, then I will too. I won't sit back and let them destroy you, or anyone else, just for their own gain." Clint couldn't believe what he was hearing. Julia Roberts, one of the most powerful women in Hollywood, was offering to stand by him. This was the kind of ally he needed, someone with the influence and platform to challenge the system. "Why now?" he asked. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I'm tired of hiding," Julia replied, her voice tinged with a sense of finality. "Tired of pretending like everything's fine when it's not. We can't keep pretending, Clint. We have to fight back." Clint let her words sink in. This was the lifeline he needed, but he couldn't afford to take it for granted. Julia's decision to back him could cost her everything, her career, her reputation, even her safety. In this industry, loyalty was a rare commodity, and Julia was taking a huge risk by standing in his corner. "I don't know what to say," Clint said, his voice soft with gratitude. "You don't have to do this." Julia's voice grew resolute. "I'm not asking for thanks. I'm asking you to let me help. Together, we can turn this around." Clint sat in silence for a moment, processing her words. The weight of the situation seemed to lessen just a bit, knowing that someone like Julia Roberts was willing to stand with him. The fight wasn't over, but maybe, just maybe, it was about to get a little easier. The following days were a blur. Clint and Julia worked together, using their combined star power and influence to get the truth out there. They began to plan their next move, reaching out to others in the industry who had been similarly silenced by the system. One by one, more voices joined the cause, each person bringing their own story of betrayal, exploitation, and corruption. Clint's legal team was busier than ever, gathering evidence, preparing documents, and meeting with investigative journalists. They worked around the clock, making sure that everything was airtight. Clint couldn't afford to make a mistake. This wasn't just about his reputation anymore, it was about bringing down the entire machine that had profited off the exploitation of so many. The tide was slowly turning. The media, once quick to denounce Clint, was now taking a harder look at the allegations. They were beginning to question the narrative that had been so carefully constructed. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear, Clint Eastwood wasn't just a victim in this story, he was a symbol of something much bigger. Then came the moment Clint had been waiting for. The release of a comprehensive report that exposed the full extent of the industry's corruption. It was a bombshell, one that sent shockwaves through Hollywood. The report detailed years of systemic abuse, coercion, and manipulation, naming powerful figures in the industry who had turned a blind eye to the suffering of countless actors. Clint and Julia were at the forefront of the movement, but now, they were no longer alone. The report had ignited a firestorm, and there was no turning back. The public was demanding accountability, and the industry was scrambling to cover its tracks. But Clint knew this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. As he stood at the center of the storm, he realized something: this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the future of Hollywood, and he was going to make sure that future was different. The days following the release of the explosive report were a blur. News outlets around the world were fixated on the bombshell Clint Eastwood and Julia Roberts had unleashed. What had once been a single thread of rebellion was now a full-blown revolution, and Hollywood's dark secrets were coming to light. The studios, once so untouchable, found themselves under siege. Attorneys scrambled to prevent further damage, PR teams worked overtime to spin their way out of the mess, and a flood of calls came through to Clint's team. The public wanted answers, and the media was hungry for more. But Clint wasn't interested in what the media had to say. He had come to a conclusion after his years in the business: the press would always bend the truth to fit its agenda. What mattered now was the truth he had laid out in the report. It was raw. It was uncomfortable. It was undeniable. The first few days were chaotic, but Clint found a strange sense of clarity. As he sat in his suite in the hotel, he reflected on how far he'd come. This wasn't just about clearing his name or taking down the people who had betrayed him. This was about something much larger: the future of Hollywood. The system that had exploited so many for years was crumbling, and Clint was at the heart of it. He stood up from the desk, staring out the window. A storm was brewing outside, dark clouds gathering in the distance. It was as if the world itself was mirroring his feelings. It was going to be a long, hard fight, but there was no turning back now. Later that afternoon, Clint met with his legal team and a few trusted allies. Julia Roberts was there, as well as Brad Pitt, who had been a constant support throughout the ordeal. George Clooney, who had kept his distance at first, was also present. Together, they had become the core group leading the charge to expose the truth. "We need to make sure we don't lose momentum," Brad said, pacing around the conference room. "The media is eating this up right now, but we need to keep pushing. If we let the pressure fade, it'll all blow over." Clint nodded. "I agree. But we can't just ride on the coattails of the report. We need to build on it. Keep the pressure on." Julia, who had been silent up until this point, spoke up. "It's not just about us anymore. It's about everyone who's been hurt by this industry. We've started something bigger than ourselves. If we don't see this through to the end, we'll let down the people who are counting on us to change things." Clint's gaze met hers. "You're right, Julia. This fight is bigger than just me. We're doing this for everyone who's been silenced. And we can't stop until we've exposed everything." With renewed purpose, they began to strategize. The plan was simple: the next phase was all about pushing for real change. The report had already given them the evidence, but now they needed to turn public sentiment in their favor. They would use their collective influence to rally the masses, holding the studios and power players accountable for their actions. But the deeper Clint went into this fight, the more it became clear that the people he was up against would stop at nothing to maintain control. They had too much power, too many resources. And they had no intention of letting someone like Clint tear down the empire they had built. One evening, Clint received a chilling message. It was a letter, sent anonymously, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was from Uma Thurman. The letter was short, but the implications were profound. "Clint. I know you think you've got it all figured out, but you don't. What you're doing is dangerous. There's no coming back from this. I've made my peace with what I've done, but you still have a chance to walk away. If you want to save what's left of your career and your soul, you'll stop now. Uma." Clint's hands trembled slightly as he read the words. Uma had been a close friend, someone he had confided in, someone he had trusted. And yet, here she was, warning him to back off. The fear in her letter wasn't just a personal warning, it was a threat. The deeper Clint delved into this, the more dangerous it became. But Clint wasn't backing down. He knew what he had to do, and there was no turning back. The media frenzy intensified. Protesters gathered outside studio headquarters, demanding accountability. Social media was abuzz with hashtags calling for justice. Celebrities who had previously stayed silent were now speaking out, joining the movement Clint had started. But the studios weren't going down without a fight. They had hired private investigators, hired PR firms, and even tried to bribe certain journalists to write stories in their favor. The battle was becoming a full-blown war, and Clint was squarely in the crosshairs. Then, the unthinkable happened. Late one evening, Clint received a phone call from a source inside one of the major studios. The voice on the other end was masked, but Clint could hear the fear in their voice. "You're in more danger than you realize, Clint. They're coming for you. You've pissed off the wrong people." Clint's heart skipped a beat. "Who is this? What are you talking about?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, they dropped a bombshell. "They've already made plans to silence you. If you want to stay alive, you need to disappear." The line went dead. Clint sat in stunned silence. The enormity of the situation was finally hitting him. He wasn't just fighting against a broken system, he was fighting against the very people who controlled it, people who had the power to destroy him. He had become a target, and not just for his career, but for his life. Clint knew what he had to do next. He gathered his team and briefed them on the danger they were now facing. They weren't just dealing with the studio's PR machines anymore, they were dealing with something far more insidious. They had to act fast. But Clint also knew that the only way to truly win this war was to hit them where it hurt. He couldn't play by the rules of Hollywood anymore. It was time to go after the heart of the beast, the financial empire behind the studios. And that's exactly what he did. Clint's team, including Julia, Brad, and George, began to work with financial experts to track the money trails behind the major studios. They uncovered a web of shady financial dealings, insider trading, and money laundering that connected some of the biggest players in the industry. It wasn't just about taking down the corrupt executives, it was about dismantling the entire financial infrastructure that kept them in power. The plan was set into motion. Clint knew this could be his final push, his last shot at toppling the empire. But it wasn't just for him, it was for everyone who had been exploited, lied to, and discarded by the Hollywood machine. As Clint prepared for the final confrontation, he knew one thing for sure, this was his fight, and he wasn't going to lose. The days leading up to Clint's final move felt like a slow burn. The tension in the air was palpable, and Clint could feel it in his bones. The legal strategy had been set in motion. The financial schemes behind the studios had been uncovered. All the pieces were in place, but the final act of this drama would require precision, timing, and, most of all, courage. Clint had spent his entire life fighting, first on the screen, then off. He'd fought against the odds, against his own doubts, against a system that had tried to break him. Now, the fight was bigger than it had ever been. It was not just his career on the line, it was the future of an industry that had built its empire on secrets, lies, and exploitation. But Clint wasn't about to let Hollywood's corruption win. He had a plan. He had the evidence. And with his team, led by Julia, Brad, and George, he would bring everything crashing down. The night before they were set to unveil everything, Clint sat alone in his penthouse, a glass of bourbon in hand. The city sprawled beneath him, the lights twinkling in the distance like 1,000 stars fighting against the darkness. It reminded him of how he'd felt growing up, small, insignificant, but determined to carve out his own place in the world. The phone on his desk buzzed. It was a text from Julia. "You ready for tomorrow?" Clint didn't hesitate. "As ready as I'll ever be." A minute passed, then another message came through. "You've got this. But just remember, this isn't just for us. It's for everyone." Clint took a deep breath. He didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. Tomorrow, everything would change. The following morning, Clint, Julia, Brad, and George gathered in the war room. It was a sterile, high-tech conference room with a wall of screens, each one showing real-time media coverage, live feeds from protesters outside the studio gates, and financial reports detailing the millions that had been funneled through shady accounts. It was all coming to a head. "Everyone's ready?" Clint asked, his voice calm but commanding. Brad nodded. "We've got everything set up. The reporters are waiting. The lawyers are standing by. The moment we drop the full financial report and evidence, the studios won't know what hit them." Clint looked over at Julia, who was scrolling through her phone, her expression focused but unwavering. She was as ready as he was. They'd been through too much together to back out now. Clint gave a short nod. "Let's do it." The press conference was scheduled for noon, and by the time Clint, Julia, and the rest of the team arrived at the venue, the room was already packed. The media had gathered in droves, eager to hear the latest developments, hungry for the next big scoop. As Clint made his way to the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. He had expected the tension, but even he wasn't prepared for the weight of all those eyes, all those cameras, all those microphones aimed directly at him. But he stood tall, his eyes steady, his hands clasped at the podium. "Thank you for coming," Clint began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of resolve. "What we have to say today is something that's been a long time coming. It's a story that's been buried for far too long. But the truth is out now, and it will not be silenced." A murmur spread through the crowd. The media was leaning in, cameras clicking away as they hung on his every word. Clint took a deep breath, then continued. "For years, the studios have controlled not just the movies you watch, but the very fabric of Hollywood itself. They've hidden their corruption, their abuse, their exploitation of actors, directors, and writers. They've silenced anyone who tried to speak out. But today, that ends." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. Clint nodded to Brad, who pressed a button on his laptop. Instantly, the large screen behind Clint flickered to life. What followed was a shocking display of evidence, emails, financial documents, video footage, showing the full extent of the studio's manipulation and exploitation. Every word, every figure, every piece of evidence was damning. The media gasped. Some reporters even stood up, their mouths agape, as they processed what they were seeing. The truth was undeniable. "The financial trails lead directly to the top," Clint said, his voice unwavering. "We have the names, the dates, the deals. What you're seeing on this screen is just the beginning. These people used their power to exploit anyone who dared to get in their way. But today, we take that power back." Clint turned toward Julia, who was standing by his side. She stepped forward, her voice carrying through the room. "I've been a part of this system for far too long," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "I've been complicit in the lies. But no more. We have a responsibility to change this industry, to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Because if we don't, nothing will ever change." The room was electric, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Clint knew that the studios would try to fight back, but it didn't matter anymore. The truth was out. There was no hiding it. The next few days were a whirlwind of chaos. The media exploded with the story, covering every detail of the scandal. Protesters flooded the streets outside studio headquarters, demanding accountability. Hollywood insiders who had stayed silent for years were finally speaking up, sharing their own stories of abuse and manipulation. But as Clint and his team braced for the inevitable backlash, they also knew something else: this was only the beginning. The studio heads tried everything to fight back: legal action, smear campaigns, and even an attempt to discredit Clint's credibility. But the evidence was undeniable. The public had spoken, and their demand for justice was louder than ever. Slowly, the first dominoes began to fall. Executives who had been untouchable for decades were now facing investigations. Lawsuits were filed. People lost their jobs. Hollywood was no longer the safe, controlled place it once had been. The revolution had started, and it was unstoppable. But the true victory, Clint realized, wasn't just about the exposure. It wasn't about the end of a system that had exploited people for decades. The real victory lay in the change they had set in motion. Hollywood would never be the same, but maybe, just maybe, it would be better for everyone involved. As Clint sat in his office, looking out over the city once more, he felt a strange sense of peace. The fight was far from over, but the battle had been won. He had taken down the system that had held so many people in chains. And in doing so, he had changed Hollywood forever. Juliet joined him in the office, standing beside him as they looked out at the city. "You did it," she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. Clint turned to her, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "We did it," he corrected her. "All of us." The battle Clint Eastwood fought wasn't just about exposing Hollywood's corruption, it was about creating a new world for future generations. By standing up, risking everything, and gathering the courage to push for the truth, Clint and his team had dismantled an empire built on exploitation and deceit. The revolution had started, and while the road ahead remained uncertain, Clint knew one thing for sure: the truth had set them free. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?